The man did not even look up when he said it. That was the part Ruby Dawson would remember longest, not the words themselves, not the humiliation of being spoken about, like a piece of livestock that had arrived slightly damaged, but the fact that Harold Mercer kept his eyes on the papers, spread across his desk, the entire time he told the stagecoach driver that she was not what he had ordered. "She's marked up," he said. "I'm not taking marked up goods." Ruby stood in the doorway of the Fort McDowell land office, with her one traveling bag hanging from her left hand, and 3 days of Arizona dust on her dress, and she heard those words settle into the room, the way a stone drops into still water, heavy, final, spreading out in every direction. The driver, a sun-leathered man named Corbett, who had barely said 12 words to her across 400 miles of desert road, had the decency to look uncomfortable. He shifted his weight and scratched the back of his neck and looked at Ruby the way people look at accidents they cannot do anything about. Harold Mercer finally glanced up. He was perhaps 50, with a neat mustache and the kind of face that wore respectability, like a coat he had purchased rather than earned. His eyes moved across Ruby's face with the efficiency of a man appraising cattle, and whatever he saw in the yellowing bruise that curved along her left cheekbone, in the careful way she held her jaw, in the faint shadows beneath her eye, that no amount of powder had fully managed to cover whatever he saw, made his expression settle into something final and dismissive. "I wrote very specifically," he said. "I wrote that I wanted a woman of good health and sound appearance. This is not that." Ruby did not say anything. She had learned over years of practice how to hold herself perfectly still when her instinct was to either run or fight. She stood in that doorway and she breathed, and she let the words land where they wanted. "The agency will have to refund my deposit," Mercer said, addressing this to Corbett rather than to Ruby, as if she had already ceased to exist. "I don't know who put that together, but this is not acceptable. If you've ever arrived somewhere and understood immediately that the welcome you had hoped for wasn't coming if you've been looked at and found lacking someone who never knew you at all, then you already understand something about Ruby Dawson. If this story has ever sounded like your own, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next, and hit that like button so this story can find the people who need to hear it. Drop a comment with your city or country. I want to know how far this has traveled. Because what happens to Ruby in the next few minutes is going to change everything, and it starts with a stranger who is standing just outside that door. Ruby had left Boston on a Tuesday morning in March of 1883 with $42, one traveling bag, and a letter from the Frontier Matrimonial Correspondence Agency confirming her arrangement with a Mr. Harold Mercer of Fort McDowell, Arizona Territory. The letter described Mr. Mercer as a man of property and steady character, a landowner with a fine house and a good reputation in the community. It described the arrangement in the language agencies used when they were selling something measured, promising, careful not to commit to anything specific. She had not told anyone in Boston where she was going. There was no one left to tell. The bruise on her cheekbone was 6 days old when she boarded the train in South Station. It had started dark purple and had moved through its colors during the journey the way bruises do toward blue, then green, then the sickly yellow it had settled into by the time the stagecoach rolled into Fort McDowell. She had done what she could with powder. She had sat with her face angled away from other passengers on the train and kept the brim of her hat low during the stagecoach ride. Though after the first 2 days, Corbett had stopped looking at her directly, which helped. She was 26 years old, and she had lived in Boston her whole life, and she had spent the last 3 years of it in a situation she had no clean language for. The man's name didn't matter now. What mattered was that she had gotten out, which had taken longer than it should have, and had cost her more than she could calculate. She had pointed herself at the only option she could find, a notice in a newspaper for Frontier Correspondence brides. A letter written carefully and hopefully, and a response from Harold Mercer that said he was looking for a capable woman to run a household and that she sounded suitable. She had been so relieved by the word suitable that she had cried for 20 minutes after reading it. Now she stood in the doorway of the Fort McDowell land office, while Harold Mercer discussed the logistics of returning his deposit, and she tried to calculate what $42 could do for her out here. "Could not do much, ma'am." Corbett was addressing her now, his voice quiet and not unkind. "You'll need to step aside. I've got to unload." Ruby stepped aside. She walked out of the land office and onto the wooden sidewalk in front of it, and she stood in the full Arizona sun, and she looked at Fort McDowell. It was a dusty, flat, sun-hammered little settlement, a main street with a dozen buildings on each side, a livery stable at the far end, A general store, 2 saloons, a church with peeling paint. Not much. She had known it would not be much. She had been prepared for not much. What she had not prepared for was being turned away at the door. She sat down on the edge of the sidewalk because her legs weren't going to hold her up through the next several minutes, and she put her traveling bag between her feet, and she looked at the street. A dog crossed it. 2 men came out of the saloon and walked in the other direction without noticing her. Somewhere a horse was complaining about something. The sun pressed down on everything like a flat, hot hand. She was thinking about the $42. She was thinking about Tucson, which was the nearest real city, and what a stagecoach ticket to Tucson might cost, and what Tucson might offer a woman with no connections and a healing bruise and a traveling bag. She was running numbers that did not add up to anything encouraging. You look like someone who just got told the house they bought burned down before they arrived. Ruby looked up. The man standing on the sidewalk above her was perhaps 35, maybe 40. It was hard to tell with men who worked outdoors in this country because the sun aged them, and the wind aged them, and the work aged them, and they ended up somewhere between what they were and what the land had made them. He was tall and lean in the way of someone who had been doing hard physical labor long enough that there was nothing on him that wasn't required. He wore a hat that had been through several seasons and boots that had been resoled at least once and a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. His face was angular, a little weathered, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not pity, exactly, but was something more careful than simple curiosity. Something like that, Ruby said. She was not sure why she answered. Tired, probably. Too tired to be guarded. The man crouched down, actually crouched, so he wasn't looming over her, and he looked at her with dark eyes that were steady without being intense. You came in on the Corbett stage? Yes. You're the woman Harold Mercer was expecting. It was not a question, so she didn't answer it as one. She just looked at him. I was waiting for someone else, he said. My hired hand was supposed to come in on that stage. He didn't. He paused. Mercer was at the stage, turned you away, went back to his office. Is that right? That's right. He looked at the land office door, then back at her. Something moved across his face, brief, controlled, not entirely readable. What are you going to do now? I'm still working that out. He nodded, like this was a reasonable answer. He didn't offer solutions or advice or sympathy, which Ruby appreciated more than she could have explained. He just crouched there and seemed to be thinking. My name is Clayton Keller, he said. I've got a ranch about 4 miles out, the Keller place. You can ask anyone in town. They'll tell you I'm not a lunatic or a criminal. He said this last part completely without humor, like it was just information. Got a spare room, and I'm willing to offer you a meal and a place to rest while you figure out what you want to do. No conditions on that. Ruby looked at him. In her experience, there were always conditions. Why, she asked. He stood up, brushing dust off his knee. Because you look like someone who needs an hour before making a decision, and making decisions when you're depleted is how people end up worse off than they started. He looked down the street. I've got to get some things from the general store. Take your time. Ruby watched him go. He didn't look back. He went into the general store, and the door closed behind him, and she sat on the sidewalk in the Arizona sun and tried to figure out if she was reading this correctly or if she was too desperate to read anything correctly at all. She was still sitting there when he came out 20 minutes later with a canvas sack of supplies and did not seem surprised to find her. Do you have a horse? He asked. No, I've got a wagon. You can ride in the back or the front, either one. Ruby picked up her traveling bag and stood up. I don't know anything about you, she said. That's fair, he said. I don't know anything about you either. We're starting even. The Keller Ranch was exactly what Clayton Keller looked like, functional, unsentimental, and more solid than it appeared at first glance. The house was low and built from adobe and timber, the kind of structure that had been added to over time as need required, rooms growing off the original square in an irregular pattern that made sense when you knew the reason for each addition but looked slightly chaotic otherwise. There was a barn, a bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived, a well, a vegetable garden that was fighting the Arizona soil with moderate success. A woman came out of the house when the wagon rolled in. She was perhaps 60 stout, with thick gray hair pinned back, and an expression that was assessing without being unfriendly. She wiped her hands on an apron and looked at Ruby in the wagon bed. This is Nora, Clayton said, climbing down. She's been cooking and running the house since my father's time. She'll show you where you can wash up. You could introduce me proper, Nora said to him, then shifted her attention to Ruby. Come on down. You look like you've been traveling for a week. 3 days, Ruby said. 3 days in a stagecoach is a week by any honest count. Nora reached up and helped Ruby down with hands that were strong and businesslike. Got a room. It's small, but it's clean. I'll get water heated. Ruby stood in the dirt of the yard and held her traveling bag and felt the strange disorientation of having arrived somewhere she had not expected to arrive. Plan had been Fort McDowell, the land office, Harold Mercer. Plan had collapsed. Now she was 4 miles outside of town on a ranch that belonged to a man she had met an hour ago, and she had either made a reasonable decision or a desperate one, and she couldn't tell yet which it was. The bruise, Nora said quietly, walking beside her toward the house. Does it still hurt? Not much, Ruby said. It's old enough. Nora made a sound in her throat that wasn't exactly a response. She held the door open. Come in then. We'll figure out the rest later. The room was small, as promised, and clean, as promised a narrow bed with a wool blanket, a window that faced the mountains, a washstand with a pitcher and a basin. Ruby sat on the edge of the bed after Nora brought hot water and left, and she looked at her hands in her lap for a while. She had gotten out. That was the thing she kept returning to. Whatever happened next Tucson, or this ranch, or some other option she hadn't identified yet, she had gotten out of Boston, and the man who had put the bruise on her face did not know where she was. That was something. That was actually a significant something, and she needed to remember it when the fear started crowding in. She washed her face and her hands. She changed into the cleaner of her 2 dresses. She sat at the window and looked at the mountains, which were closer here than mountains ever were in Boston, enormous and purple in the late afternoon light, and tried to organize her thoughts into something resembling a plan. There was a knock at the door. Come in, she said. Clayton Keller opened the door and stood in the frame. He didn't come in. Supper's about an hour, he said. I wanted to tell you something before then, while there's time to say it right. Ruby waited. What Mercer did today was wrong, he said. I don't know your situation, and I'm not asking you to explain it, but what he did was wrong, and you should know that somebody around here recognizes that. He said this straightforwardly, without working up to it. You're welcome here, as long as you need to be. If you want to go to Tucson in the morning, I'll take you to the stage. If you want a week to figure things out, you can have it. If there's something else you need, tell me, and I'll see what I can do. Ruby looked at him. What do you want in return? He looked mildly irritated by the question, which surprised her. Nothing, he said. That's not how it works here. He started to pull the door closed. Supper in an hour. He was gone before she could answer. The supper table seated 8, and 6 people were at it that night. Clayton, Nora, 3 ranch hands named Dex and Foster, and a young man everyone called Rook, who couldn't have been older than 19, and Ruby. The ranch hands were polite in a rough and careful way. They clearly had not been briefed on her exact situation, but had been briefed on something, because they didn't ask questions, and they passed dishes to her first, and they kept the conversation on horses and fence lines, and whether a certain section of pasture was going to hold through the summer. Nora talked about the vegetable garden with the passionate frustration of someone engaged in a long war. Clayton ate steadily and said relatively little, but he was the kind of person whose silence had weight to it, not cold, not absent, just contained. Ruby ate more than she had expected to. She hadn't been eating well on the journey, partly from nerves, and partly from the limited options a stagecoach diet offered. Nora's cooking was plain and enormous in quantity, and better than Ruby had any right to expect from a ranch kitchen in the middle of nowhere. After supper, Rook helped Nora clear the table with the practiced automaticity of a kid who had been doing this for years. Dex and Foster went out to the bunkhouse. Clayton poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Ruby without asking and sat down across from her. Thinking, he said. About what? He wrapped both hands around his cup. The agency Mercer used, I know it. The Frontier Matrimonial Correspondence Agency out of St. Louis. I know the man who runs it. He's honest enough. He's been operating 15 years without scandal. He'll want to know what happened today. Ruby looked at her coffee to Seuss. I don't imagine there's much he can do about it. Maybe not. But men like Mercer, they don't always behave that way with the first woman. And if someone documents it, it makes a record. He looked at her. That's all I'm saying. Are you suggesting I complain about being rejected? I'm suggesting that being rejected the way you were rejected is different from just being rejected. He said this simply. A man who looks at a woman's injuries and calls her damaged goods is not someone whose behavior should go unmentioned. Ruby was quiet for a moment. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. It doesn't change my situation. No, he said, but it might change someone else's. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee. He didn't seem to be making a point or performing righteousness. He seemed to be thinking out loud, genuinely, in the way of someone working through a problem that bothered him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can. Why were you at the stage this afternoon? Your hired hand, you said he didn't come. But you stayed around long enough to see what happened with Mercer." Clayton was quiet for a moment. "I've known Harold Mercer for 9 years," he said. "I had a feeling." "What kind of feeling?" He looked up. "Kind that says you should stay nearby when something's about to go wrong." He stood up and took his coffee cup to the counter. "Get some sleep. We can talk tomorrow if you want to or not. Either way is fine." He went to bed. Ruby sat the table for a while after he left. She listened to the sounds of the ranch, settling at night, the horses in the barn, the distant sound of the ranch hands in the bunkhouse, the wind coming down from the mountains. In Boston, the nights sounded like a city. Out here, they sounded like something else entirely, something older and less concerned with human problems. She finished her coffee and went to her room and lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Clayton Keller's hands wrapped around his coffee cup and the straightforward way he said things and the look on his face when she'd asked what he wanted in return. Nothing. That's not how it works here. She had spent enough time with men who wanted something to be deeply cautious of men who claimed to want nothing. And yet she fell asleep before she'd finished the thought. In the morning, Nora was up before dawn, and Ruby, who had been a light sleeper for years out of necessity, heard the sound of the kitchen and got up and dressed and went out. "You don't have to help," Nora said without turning around from the stove. "I know I don't," Ruby said, and picked up an apron from the hook by the door. They worked alongside each other in the kitchen, and nothing was said about it. Ruby had grown up cooking because her mother was sick and then gone, and she knew her way around a stove and a basins and the logistical calculus of feeding multiple people on a schedule. Nora noticed this without commenting on it and moved her slightly so their working patterns didn't conflict, and they got breakfast on the table by the time the ranch hands came in. Clayton came in last, just as he had apparently always done, and sat down at his place and looked across the table at Ruby and then looked at Nora. "She helped," Nora said preemptively, in a tone that closed any discussion before it started. Clayton looked back at Ruby. "Sleep all right?" "Better than I have in a while," she said, which was true. After breakfast, when the ranch hands had dispersed to their morning work and Nora had disappeared into some other domestic undertaking, Clayton poured the last of the coffee and set it in front of Ruby and leaned against the counter. "I have a proposition," he said. Not the arrangement Mercer had in mind. Something different. Ruby looked at him. "I need help on this ranch. Nora handles the house, but she's not young anymore and she's been doing too much. There's correspondence that piles up, supply accounting that I'm behind on, some organizational work with livestock records that I've been avoiding for 2 years." He looked slightly embarrassed by this last admission. "I'm offering you a working arrangement, a wage. Your room and meals included. You'd have your own income and your own situation. If you decide at any point you want to go to Tucson or back east or wherever else, you'd go with money in your pocket and I'd take you to the stage myself." Ruby looked at the table. She thought about the $42. "And if I stay," she said, "what does that look like?" "It looks like what it looks like now," he said. "You work. You get paid. You have a room. Nothing more is expected of you than what you're able to give." He paused. "I'm not Harold Mercer. I'm not looking for a woman I purchased. I just need someone who can actually help, and you seem capable." "You don't know that," she said. "You met me yesterday. I watched you eat supper at a table full of strangers after what happened yesterday," he said, "and hold yourself together. That tells me most of what I need to know." Ruby was quiet, thought about going back. There was nothing to go back to. She thought about Tucson. She had no connections there, no references, no one who knew her name. She thought about the narrow room with the window facing the mountains, and Nora moving around the kitchen without requiring her to explain herself, and the weight of Clayton Keller's steady presence across a supper table. "I'll try it," she said, "for a month. Then we reassess." He nodded, like this was a reasonable thing. Fair enough. The month was harder than she had anticipated, and not for the reasons she'd expected. The work itself she could handle. Correspondence was organizational work, the kind of thing that required attention and a clear system rather than expertise. And Ruby had spent enough years keeping her own affairs quietly, carefully ordered letters written and hidden, money saved in amounts too small to notice that she understood the logic of it quickly. Clayton's livestock records were genuinely chaotic, apparently because he had been doing them himself for 2 years, with the kind of attention a man gives to something he finds deeply boring, which is to say, minimal. She sorted them out over 2 weeks. He came in to check on her progress one morning and stood looking at the organized ledgers for a moment. "I've been looking for that number for 6 months," he said, pointing at an entry. "It was filed under the wrong year," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said, and left. It was not the work that was hard. What was hard was learning to trust stillness. Ruby had spent so long in a situation where calm was a warning, where quiet meant the next thing coming was worse, that she kept bracing for something, kept waiting for the other shoe. She startled at doors closing and went very still when voices outside raised above ordinary conversation. And sometimes she woke at 3 a.m. with her heart going fast, for no reason she could identify in the dark. Nora never asked about this. But one morning, about 2 weeks in, Ruby was at the kitchen table going through correspondence, and Nora set a cup of tea down in front of her and said, without preamble, "It takes longer than a month to stop listening for something that's not there anymore." Ruby looked up. "I'm not asking," Nora said, and went back to the stove. Ruby wrapped both hands around the teacup and felt something move in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but was located somewhere between them. It was Dex who started treating her like she was one of them. He was in his 40s, a compact, weathered man who had been working for Clayton for 8 years, and who had very fixed views on how things should be done, most of which involved doing them efficiently and without complaint. He had looked at Ruby her first week with the cautious wariness of someone waiting to see if a new element would disrupt a working system. By the second week, when she'd stayed out of the way of the working system and demonstrated she could carry her weight, he'd begun including her in the casual working conversation, letting her know when the supply delivery was coming, asking if she'd added anything to the order, the small informational exchanges that constitute being included. By the end of the third week, he was doing something that Ruby only fully recognized in retrospect. He was standing near her when strangers came to the ranch. Not obviously, not making a production of it, just positioned, close enough. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. Foster, who was younger and quieter, and seemed to communicate largely through nods and brief exhalations, brought her a wildflower one afternoon and left it on the porch railing and walked away before she could respond. Put it in a glass of water on the kitchen windowsill. Rook asked her if she knew how to play cards, and she said yes, and he said he could teach her one she probably didn't know, and she humored him, and he spent an hour teaching her a game. She was almost certain he was making up as he went, which she played with great apparent seriousness. The ranch, which had looked like a temporary situation, was beginning to feel like something else. About 3 weeks into her stay, Ruby was in the barn with Foster, who was explaining the difference between 2 horses that looked identical to her, when she heard voices from outside Clayton's, and another one she didn't recognize, harder and carrying the particular note of someone who expected to be agreed with. She didn't go out. She stayed with Foster, who had gone still in the way of someone listening. "That's Mercer," he said quietly. "What does he want?" "Don't know." Foster glanced at her. "Probably nothing to do with you." But then Ruby heard her name, and she went to the barn door. Harold Mercer was standing in the yard with his coat on, despite the heat, and he was talking to Clayton in the voice of someone who had come to deliver a judgment. He was talking about the agency, about the deposit, about how the agency was apparently claiming he owed them a fee, regardless of the outcome. And he was talking about it in the particular way of men who have decided someone else is to blame for their inconvenience. "I want to know," Mercer was saying, "what that woman told them. Because somebody said something, now they're claiming I've broken the arrangement and it's going to cost me." "The agency made that determination," Clayton said. His voice was flat, based on what she said. "I know how these things work." Mercer's gaze moved toward the barn and found Ruby in the doorway, and he stopped. Whatever he read in her face, or in the fact that she was standing there looking at him without looking away, seemed to recalibrate something for him. "Came here as a courtesy," he said, to Clayton, still looking at Ruby. "Came here to complain," Clayton said. "There's a difference." Mercer straightened his coat. "She's nobody," he said, still looking at her. "She showed up damaged. She had no business." Mercer Clayton's voice had not raised, but it had changed in a way that made Foster shift beside Ruby. "You need to leave my property now." Mercer looked at Clayton. Something in what he saw there settled the argument without further discussion. He turned and walked back to his horse and mounted and rode out without another word. Clayton turned and looked at Ruby. "You all right?" She had been holding herself very still the way she did. She made herself breathe out. I wrote a letter to the agency, she said, 3 days ago. About what happened. I should have told you. He looked at her for a moment. Why would you need to tell me? She wasn't sure she had an answer for that. You did the right thing, he said. Don't second guess it. He turned and went back to whatever he had been doing before Mercer arrived, and that was the end of the discussion. The month became 6 weeks, and Ruby stopped counting. She had written to no one in Boston. There was no one in Boston who required a letter. She had gradually acquired a few things for her room, a small mirror, a book she'd found in the back of the general store, a pot of dried lavender Nora had given her, saying it helped the air. She had learned which boards on the porch creaked in the morning and adjusted her step without thinking. She knew the sound of the horses by now, could tell from the barn which one was restless and which was just breathing, and she wasn't entirely sure when she'd acquired that knowledge. One evening, about 6 weeks in, she was on the porch after supper, sitting in the chair that had apparently become her chair without any negotiation, watching the mountains go dark, when Clayton came out and sat in the other chair. They sat without talking for a while. Sky over the mountains went through its nightly sequence, pink to orange, to a deep purple that was almost violet, then rapidly to dark and full of stars, which were more and brighter out here than any sky Ruby had seen before. You're staying, Clayton said. It was not quite a question. I'm staying, she said. He nodded. He seemed neither surprised nor particularly relieved, just it seemed confirmed in something he had already thought. I'm glad, he said. Ruby looked at the stars. She was thinking about the stagecoach, and the Bruises, and the land office doorway, and the $42, and the man across the table from her who had crouched down on a sidewalk so he wasn't looming. She was thinking about how much had shifted in 6 weeks from a woman sitting on a curb with a traveling bag and no plan and a decision to make. Can I ask you something? She said, You can. Did you know Mercer was going to turn me away? Before it happened? Clayton was quiet for a moment. I suspected it was possible, he said. He'd had a woman come in the year before. Said she was too old. Sent her back east. He paused. I thought about writing to the agency then. I didn't. I've thought about that since. Ruby looked at him. Can't rescue everyone. I know. He turned his head and looked at her. His face was not particularly readable in the dark, but his eyes were steady in the way she had come to associate with him that particular quality of attention that wasn't searching or performing, just present. You didn't need rescuing anyway. You'd already done the hard part before I found you. Ruby looked back at the mountains. She thought he was probably right. She had done the hard part, the leaving, the surviving, the $42, and the stagecoach, and the sits on the sidewalk, and the assessing the stranger who offered her water and a room with no conditions. She had done all of that herself. What she'd found at the other end of it was not a rescue place. The mountains were black shapes against a sky swimming with stars, and the wind came down from them carrying something that smelled like cold stone and distance. And Ruby sat in the chair that had become her chair on the porch of a ranch that was beginning to feel like it had space in it shaped like her, and she breathed the Arizona air and did not feel afraid. Not even a little. The wildflower rook had left on the porch railing was still on the kitchen windowsill, dried out now, the petals gone papery and curled at the edges, but Ruby hadn't thrown it away. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because it was the first thing anyone had given her in a long time that had no conditions attached to it. No expectation of gratitude, no ledger being kept. A kid with a flower, and nothing to say about it. She'd kept it the way you keep something that surprises you into feeling more than you expected to feel. That was the thing about the Keller ranch that Ruby was still working out, 2 months in. Nothing here operated the way she had learned things operated. People here didn't keep visible score. They didn't announce what they were doing for you or remind you of it later. They just did things Dex, positioning himself near her when strangers came. Nora setting down tea without commentary. Foster with his nods and his silence that managed somehow to be companionable rather than cold, and then they moved on. And the thing they'd done sat quietly in the air between you, not requiring acknowledgement, not demanding anything in return. Ruby was not used to this. She kept expecting to find the invoice. She was reorganizing the second year of livestock records on a Tuesday morning in late May, when she heard the sound of a horse coming into the yard, fast, too fast for an ordinary arrival, the particular rhythm of urgency, and then Clayton's voice outside, sharp and clipped, which was different from his regular voice in a way she'd already learned to notice. She went to the window. There was a man on a horse she didn't recognize, young and lean and dusty from hard riding, and he was talking to Clayton in short bursts, gesturing back toward the east. Clayton listened without interrupting. He had his hands on his hips and his hat was off, and he was squinting slightly, which was a thing he did when he was calculating something. She'd noticed running through options, measuring them against each other. The young man finished talking. Clayton put his hat back on. He turned and found her in the window, and he held up 2 fingers, which she had learned meant he needed 2 minutes, and then he'd explain. She went back to the ledgers. The 2 minutes were closer to 10. When Clayton came in, he poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter and drank half of it before he said anything. That was Danny Price, he said, from the Gable Creek area. His family's got a homestead about 12 miles out. He set the cup down. There's a man named Aldous Crane who's been buying up land in the eastern section for the past 18 months. Or not buying, pressuring, letting cattle onto homesteaders' property, fouling wells, running off help. Price family's been holding out. 3 days ago, someone cut their fence line and let their horses out. They spent 2 days rounding them up. Cost them work time they couldn't afford. Ruby was looking at him. Is this a common situation? In territory land, he said, it's not uncommon. A man with money and patience can make life hard enough for small homesteaders that they sell for whatever he's offering, just to be done. He picked up the cup again. Crane's been after a water source the Price land controls access to. It would let him expand his grazing north. He drank the rest of the coffee. Danny came here because his father asked him to. The Prices want help filing a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office. Why didn't his father come himself? Because someone needs to stay on the property. Leave it empty right now and there might not be a property to come back to. He said this matter-of-factly, the way he says most things. I've dealt with the Territorial Land Office before. Process has some obstacles. What kind of obstacles? He looked at her with an expression that was dry enough to be almost humor. Kind that have names and relationships with people like Crane. He moved toward the door. I'm going to ride out to the Price place today. I want to see what they're dealing with firsthand before I decide how to approach the filing. He was at the door when she said, I can help with the correspondence. Stopped and turned. If you need letters written to the land office, she said. I've been through enough of your correspondence to know the language it takes. Formal requests, the proper addresses, how to structure a complaint so it doesn't look like a complaint, which is usually how you get complaints addressed. Clayton looked at her for a moment. You've dealt with that kind of paperwork before? She had. Not land office paperwork specifically, but the bureaucratic logic of getting official bodies to move, that she understood from the kind of careful, systematic survival she'd had to do in Boston. You didn't storm institutions, you learned their language, and you wrote in it with enough precision that ignoring you became harder than addressing you. I have, Shide said. He nodded. All right, I'll bring back whatever documents they have and we'll go through them. He left. The sound of his horse going out of the yard was different from the urgency of Danny Price's arrival, steady, deliberate, the pace of someone who wasn't panicking but wasn't wasting time either. Ruby went back to the ledgers. Outside, the May sun was burning down on the yard, and somewhere in the barn, one of the horses was moving around in its stall. She thought about Aldous Crane, whom she didn't know, and about the logic of men who were patient enough to make things difficult by degrees rather than all at once. She understood that logic in a way she wished she didn't. Clayton came back after dark with a leather folder of documents and a look on his face that was controlled in the specific way of someone who had seen something that made them angry and had decided not to be visibly angry about it yet. He put the folder on the kitchen table. Nora set a plate in front of him, and he ate without tasting it, which Ruby could tell because he ate the same amount in the same time, regardless of what was on the plate, which was not how he ate when he was actually eating. After supper, she opened the folder. The Price family's documentation was partial, and in places damaged, some pages water-stained, some entries in handwriting that was clearly multiple people's over multiple years. Their original land claim was there, properly filed in 1877, but the follow-up surveys were incomplete. There was a letter from someone at the Territorial Land Office written 18 months ago in language that was bureaucratically neutral, but was between the lines, telling them that their claim to the water access was under review. There was no record of them responding to it, which probably meant they hadn't understood that they needed to. They didn't know they were supposed to reply, Ruby said. Clayton was across the table, reading the same page she'd already read. How can you tell? Because if they had replied, there'd be a copy here. These people keep everything. She set down the page. Someone at the land office sent them a notice that was worded to look like information, when it was actually a deadline. If they didn't respond to confirm their claim to the water access within 60 days, the office was entitled to treat the access as disputed. She looked at the date on the letter. That was 14 months ago. Clayton looked at the date. So the access has been in dispute status for over a year. Which is why Crane is moving now, Ruby said. He's been waiting for the clock to run out, and now it has. And he's trying to get the prices off the land before anyone notices there's a window to contest it. She looked at the other documents. How old is the father, Elias Price? 60-something. He's been on that land 20 years. Built everything himself. Ruby thought about that. A man who built a homestead over 20 years, who had probably never thought much about the paperwork because the land was self-evidently his, who had received a letter he didn't fully understand and had no one to tell him what it meant. There's a 60-day window to file a formal contest, she said, from the date a dispute is entered into an active claim. It's a territorial rule. She had found this in the folder, a printed copy of territorial land regulations, dog-eared and partly illegible, but the relevant section was clear enough. The question is when the dispute was officially entered. If it was entered when Crane first filed his challenge, I don't see that here, but it would be in the land office records. Then we need to know that date. Clayton looked at her. How do you know that rule? I found it in this folder, she said, tapping the printed regulations. Your Mr. Price does his research. He just doesn't know which parts of it matter. Something moved across Clayton's face, not quite a smile too serious for that, but something that was paying close attention in a way that felt distinct from how he usually paid attention. You understood all that in an hour. It's not complicated once you see the structure, she said. Complication is that the Territorial Land Office is going to be resistant to receiving a contest from the Prices directly, especially if Crane has relationships there. The filing needs to come from someone they can't easily dismiss. She paused. Someone with standing in the county. Someone whose name means something in that office. Clayton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Write the letter. I'll draft it, she said. You'll need to review it and sign it. Standing has to be yours, all right. She pulled a clean sheet of paper from the correspondence drawer and picked up the pen and began. She wrote for almost 2 hours, with Clayton across the table, looking over documents and occasionally providing dates or names she asked for. He was a different kind of person to work alongside than she'd expected. He didn't hover, and he didn't make suggestions unless she specifically asked for them, and when she asked, he answered directly, and then went back to what he was doing. She had worked in proximity to men who couldn't resist involving themselves in work that wasn't theirs to involve themselves in, who had opinions about how the pen should be held or where the sentences should end, and she had learned to manage that. Clayton seemed to have a genuine ability to recognize what was his job and what wasn't, and to stay in his own lane, which was rarer than it should have been. When she pushed the draft across the table, he read it without commenting until he'd finished. Then he set it down. This is good, it's clear, she said. That's different from good. It's clear and it's got the right tone. You managed to make a legal threat sound like a request for clarification. He turned the paper slightly. That last paragraph where you referenced the 60-day provision. Will they know you know? They'll know someone knows, she said. That's the point. Crane's approach only works if the Prices look isolated. If there's a letter on their behalf that demonstrates someone has read the regulations and understands exactly what window exists and what it requires, the calculation changes for everyone involved. She looked at him. Do you know what Crane's relationship is with the land office? There's a clerk there named Whitmore, Clayton said. He and Crane have done business. I don't know the shape of it exactly. Land dealings of some kind. He paused. Whitmore is not the head of the office, but he controls the filing schedules. Ruby thought about this. Then the letter shouldn't go to Whitmore. No, Clayton agreed. Should go to Superintendent Greer, who is technically above all of it and who is also, to be fair, not someone who enjoys controversy. Good, Ruby said. Men who don't enjoy controversy tend to resolve things just to make them stop. She looked at the draft. I'll write a clean copy in the morning. You should add anything you think I've missed before then. I won't miss anything, he said. It's complete. She looked at him. He said it without flattery, just as observation, the way he said most things as though the truth didn't require packaging. Then I'll write the clean copy in the morning, she said, and began gathering the documents back into the folder. The letter went to Superintendent Greer via the stage, and the waiting started. Ruby had learned in the years she'd spent managing things quietly in Boston that waiting is its own kind of work. You had to keep doing the regular things, the correspondence, the ledgers, the meals, The morning conversations on the porch, while carrying the awareness that something was moving out there in the world that you couldn't control or hurry. You just had to hold steady and not let the waiting eat into the regular things. She was better at this than she'd expected to be out here. The ranch itself helped. There was always something that needed doing. The supply records she'd organized had flagged a vendor who had been shortchanging the order weights by small amounts over many months, not enough in any single delivery to make a clear case, but Ruby had gone back through the records and built the pattern, and Clayton had taken the documentation to the vendor's agent in Fort McDowell and come back saying the situation had been resolved, which probably meant the vendor had been confronted and had backed down. Ruby didn't ask for details. She'd done her part. She was also quietly learning things she hadn't expected to need. Rook was the one who started it. He found her one afternoon watching from the fence while Dex worked with one of the younger horses, and he came and stood beside her and said, "You want to learn?" She looked at him. "Learn what? How to ride? Proper." He leaned on the fence. "Not like you've been doing. You've been riding. Like you're afraid the horse knows something you don't." She had been riding. Clayton had put her on a calm, older mare named Agnes about 3 weeks in, and she'd gone out with Rook on short circuits of the property twice since then, which she'd thought was reasonably successful. Apparently Rook had opinions about this. "I'm not afraid of the horse," she said. "You're afraid she'll decide she doesn't want to cooperate," he said. "That's different from being afraid of the horse, but it's still a problem." This was the longest and most opinionated thing Rook had ever said to her. She looked at him with mild surprise. "Horses know when you're managing them versus when you're riding them," he said. "If you're managing, they do what they want and let you think you're involved. If you're riding, you're actually in it together." He pushed off the fence. "Come on, Agnes is in the barn," she went. Rook was a better teacher than she'd expected, largely because he corrected her without embarrassment, in either direction, no softening, no impatience, just an observation, and then a show of what he meant, and then waiting while she tried it. He had the patience of someone who had learned the same way he was teaching, which was by someone doing the same for him. She was not naturally good at it. She was too much in her head, too analytical, trying to process what she was doing while she was doing it, instead of just doing it. Rook told her this in exactly those words, and she told him she knew, and it didn't immediately fix the problem. Clayton came by the paddock at some point and watched for a few minutes from outside the fence and didn't say anything and went away, and Ruby was glad for that. Having him watch while she was figuring out something she wasn't good at, yet felt like a particular kind of vulnerability she wasn't ready for. 3 days later, she finally got what Rook meant, and Agnes moved differently under her, and Rook said, "There it is from the fence." And Ruby felt something shift in her chest, not pride exactly, but something in that neighborhood. The reply from Superintendent Greer came 3 weeks after they'd sent the letter. It arrived in the stage, and Clayton brought it in from town and set it on the table in front of Ruby and said nothing. She opened it. It was written in the careful bureaucratic language of someone who was covering themselves. It acknowledged receipt of the filing. It confirmed that the dispute status of the Price water access claim was under review. It noted in language that was technically neutral that the 60-day contest window had indeed been entered, and that the filing from Clayton Keller on behalf of the Prices constituted a valid contest under the territorial provision. It would be processed. Ruby read it twice. Then she set it down. "It worked," she said. "Partially," Clayton said. He was reading it now. "This doesn't resolve the dispute. It means the dispute goes through proper process, which means Crane can't move on the water access while it's active. That's what we needed," she said. "It buys time. Real time with the territorial office on record." He set the letter down. He looked at her with that particular quality of attention, the one that wasn't performing anything. "You've done this kind of thing before," he said. "Not land law specifically, but navigating this kind of situation." Closest he'd come to asking about her past. He'd said it as an observation, not as a question, which gave her the option of not answering. She chose to answer anyway. "In Boston," she said, "I spent about a year trying to get a protective order through the municipal court. The process took 9 months, generated 8 letters, and ultimately failed because someone in the clerk's office was acquainted with the wrong person." She looked at the Greer letter. "I learned a lot about how these systems actually work versus how they're supposed to work." Clayton was quiet for a moment. He wasn't looking at her with pity, which she checked for immediately. He was looking at her with something that was consideration. Like he was incorporating what she'd said into a picture he'd already been building. I'm sorry it failed, he said. I left instead, she said. Worked better anyway. He nodded. A beat of silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Then we should take this to Elias Price. Yes, she said. He should see it. Do you want to come? She looked at him. Yes, she said, and was slightly surprised by how quickly she said it. Elias Price was a small man who had clearly been a larger one, the kind of frame that tells you something about what a person used to carry and what the years had gradually taken. He had rough hands and careful eyes, and he stood very straight, which Ruby recognized as a form of dignity that cost something to maintain. His wife, Marta, was in the house when they arrived, and came out and stood beside him, while Clayton explained the letter, and she watched her husband's face the whole time Clayton was talking, not the letter. When Clayton finished, Elias was quiet for a moment. He took the letter and read it himself, slowly, which meant he could read well enough, but was being thorough. The water access is protected while this is active, he said. Active and on record, Clayton said. Crane can file his own arguments, but they go through the same process. And now Greer's office has our filing in their records, which means any unusual movement on the claim will be visible. Elias looked up. His eyes moved to Ruby, who was standing slightly behind and to the side of Clayton in the way she'd fallen into, not deferring, just reading the room. Understanding this was Clayton's relationship, and Elias needed to hear it from him first. Who wrote the letter? Clayton glanced at her. She did. Elias looked at Ruby for a moment with an assessment that was not unwelcoming, just real. You know the law? I know how to read it, she said, and how to write in a way that makes clear someone has. He looked at Marta. Something passed between them. That was the particular shorthand of people who have been making decisions together long enough that they don't need full sentences for it. Then he looked back at Ruby. Thank you, he said. Just that. Directly and without elaboration, she nodded. Marta brought out coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in, and they sat on the Price porch and talked about the land and the summer and the state of the fence lines, and Ruby listened more than she spoke, which was comfortable, which was something she was still getting used to. That listening without fear was a different sensation than listening while calculating threat. Riding back to the ranch in the late afternoon, with the mountains going gold on one side and the shadows of the scrub stretching long on the road, Clayton rode alongside her rather than ahead, which was different from their first rides out and something she was now aware of noticing. You did well today, he said. I didn't do much, she said. You let Elias see who did the work, he said. That mattered to him. She thought about that, about Elias's frame and his careful eyes, and the way he'd read the letter slowly, making sure he understood every word. He's been fighting alone for too long, she said. Most people out here have been fighting alone too long, Clayton said. That's the thing about the frontier. It isolates people until they forget what it feels like to have someone in their corner. She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, his profile angular against the golden light, and he said it the way he said most things, plain, like it was just a thing that was true, not a thing he was performing. Ruby thought about whether that included him. She almost asked. She didn't yet. In June, a woman named Cecile Vautron came to the ranch, came in on the stage and had apparently asked for directions from whoever she spoke to first in town, because she arrived in a rented buggy with a small trunk and an expression that combined enormous exhaustion with determined composure. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair and the particular look of someone who has been traveling not as a journey but as an escape. Ruby saw her from the yard and recognized something in her immediately that she could not have fully articulated but did not need to. She went to the buggy before anyone else came out. Are you looking for the Keller ranch? Is this it? The woman said. Her accent was faintly French, not strong, but there. This is it. Can I help you down? The woman accepted her hand and came down from the buggy with the carefully controlled movements of someone whose body was in more pain than she was letting the world see. Ruby recognized that too. I'm looking for Mr. Keller, the woman said. My name is Cecile. I was told someone told me in town that he's sometimes at his ranch. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. Her composure was very solid and was costing her. Come inside, Ruby said. I'll get you some water, and you can tell me what you need. Cecile looked at her for a moment. Something in her face shifted the particular look of someone who has been bracing for a transaction, and instead found something that didn't require one. Thank you, she said. Clayton came out from the barn, while Ruby was bringing Cecile through the door. He took in the situation without any visible calculation and held the door wider and said, There's room, to Cecile, which was not technically an answer to a question, but was the only answer that was needed. and Cecile's composure finally cracked, just slightly at the corners, and she pressed her hand to her mouth and got it back. That evening, after Cecile had been given the second spare room and fed and left to sleep, Ruby found Clayton on the porch. "Does this happen often?" she asked. He looked at the mountains. "More than it should," he said. "How long has the ranch been?" She searched for the right word. "Since my father," he said. "He had a policy. Anyone who came to this gate with nowhere else to go got a meal in a room and as long as they needed." He paused. "I kept the policy." Ruby looked at the mountains with him. "Why?" It was a simple question, but she asked it genuinely, and he was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because he did it for a family once," Clayton said finally. "When I was 8, a mother and 2 kids came through in the middle of winter. He didn't know them. He kept them 3 months, until the mother found a situation in Tucson." He looked at the yard. He said afterward that a man's land is worth something, if it's worth something to someone besides himself. He paused again. I don't know if that's philosophy or just how he talked, but it stuck. Ruby thought about the narrow room with the window facing the mountains, and the dried wildflower on the kitchen windowsill, and the dried lavender from Nora, and the space that had slowly taken the shape of her. "Worth something to someone besides himself," she said. Something like that. She stayed on the porch a while, longer than she had planned. The stars came out, always more of them here, always brighter, the sky out here taking the night seriously in a way city skies never managed. Thought about what it meant to have a gate that let people in. She thought about gates she had been on the wrong side of, and doors that closed in her face, and a man behind a desk who didn't look up, and a sidewalk and $42, and a stranger who crouched down so he wasn't looming. She thought about how you become the person you are by what you keep and what you change, and how sometimes you don't know which is which until you're in it. Cecile was in the second spare room. Elias Price's land had a formal contest on record. Ruby had ridden Agnes that morning, without managing her at all, had actually ridden her fully, both of them in it together, the way Rook had described. The bruise on her cheekbone was completely gone. Had been for weeks. She'd stopped checking in the mirror without quite noticing when. Clayton said goodnight and went inside. Ruby stayed on the porch until the stars told her it was late, and then she went inside too. Slept without startling, at 3 in the morning. And when she woke up, it was to the sound of Nora in the kitchen, and the smell of coffee, and a morning that didn't require her to brace for anything. Just a morning. Just that. It was more than she could have told you she was hoping for, when she'd sat on that sidewalk in Fort McDowell with her traveling bag and her $42 and no idea what came next. She was starting to understand quite a lot. Cecile stayed 2 weeks, then 3, then a month, and somewhere in the middle of all that she stopped being a guest and became something else, a presence at the table that the ranch hands accommodated without discussion. A second pair of hands in the kitchen that Nora incorporated into her morning routine with the efficiency of a woman who understood that more hands meant less work and asked no philosophical questions about the arrangement. She was quiet in a careful way, and she watched things before she participated in them, and Ruby recognized this because she had done exactly the same thing. They didn't talk about where Cecile had come from for the first 2 weeks. They didn't need to. They talked about the garden, which was Cecile's unexpected territory. She had grown up somewhere in Louisiana with a grandmother who had strong opinions about soil and drainage, and she applied these opinions to Nora's struggling vegetable plot with a focused competence that had Nora not only deferring but actively soliciting her input, which was not something Nora did readily with anyone about anything. By the end of June, the garden looked markedly different. Nora said nothing about this, but began putting better cuts of meat on Cecile's plate at supper. It was mid-June when Ruby found out the shape of Cecile's situation, and it happened sideways, the way real information usually does. They were on the porch in the early evening, the two of them, in the hour before supper, when the heat started to lift and the light turned orange. Cecile was mending a dress seam with the automatic focus of someone who had been doing handwork since childhood, and Ruby was reading one of the land regulation documents she'd been going through for a follow-up filing in the Price matter, and they'd been sitting together in comfortable silence for almost 20 minutes. "My husband is in Albuquerque," Cecile said. She didn't look up from the mending. Ruby didn't look up from the document either. "Is he looking for you?" "Not yet. He thinks I went to visit my cousin in Santa Paz." "I don't have a cousin in Santa Fe." "How long before he figures that out?" "Another 2 weeks, maybe. Then he'll start looking in earnest." She bit off the thread. "He has money and he has patience. Both of those are problems." Ruby set the document down. She looked at Cecile's profile, the careful composure, the steady hands, the particular quality of someone who has been thinking about this for a long time and has gotten to the place past panic, which looks calm but isn't. The money and the patience are what makes men like that dangerous, Ruby said. They can outlast you if you run. The run has to turn into something else. Cecile looked at her then. What does it turn into? Ruby thought about the letter to Superintendent Greer. She thought about the 60-day window and the filing schedule and the clerk named Whitmore and the language that made a legal threat sound like a request for clarification. Evidence, she said, documentation. Formal filings that exist in records that can't disappear. Turns into paper properly placed. Cecile was quiet for a moment. I have letters he wrote me, she said, during a period when he was explicit about what he intended. She paused. Kept them. Ruby looked at her. Where are they? In my trunk. Good. Don't tell anyone they exist until we know where to send them. She picked the document back up. I'll look into the territorial provisions for New Mexico. The laws are slightly different from Arizona, but the underlying structure of a formal complaint is the same. Cecile watched her for a moment. You're not surprised, she said. Most people are surprised. Or they tell you to go back and try harder. I know, Ruby said. Cecile looked at the mountains. Something in her face shifted not fully, not into anything dramatic, just the slight change of a person who has been carrying something alone and has just set a small piece of it down. How long did it take you, she said. Ruby thought about that. The leaving took years, she said. The getting out took about $42 and a stagecoach ticket and a sidewalk in Fort McDowell. She turned a page. The getting over it, I'll let you know when I get there. Cecile almost smiled. It was the closest she'd come to one. It was Nora who brought up the town's opinion. She did it the way Nora brought up everything she considered important directly, and without apparent concern for whether the timing was convenient. It was a Tuesday morning, Ruby at the correspondence desk, Nora at the counter. With a bowl of dough, she was working with the mechanical force of someone who had been doing this particular task for 40 years. People in town have been talking, Nora said. Ruby didn't look up. About what? About you, about the arrangement here. Nora pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. About what it means. A woman living on a man's ranch who isn't his wife and isn't his employee in any way they can see. Ruby put the pen down. What are they saying specifically? Nora looked at her with the flat pragmatism of someone reporting weather conditions. That you're either his mistress or his charity case, and neither one sits well with the respectable women in town. A few of them have said something to their husbands, and their husbands have said something to Clayton. What did Clayton say? He told Hector Baines that what happened on his property was not Hector Baines's concern, and that if Hector Baines had a specific complaint, he was welcome to come out and make it in person, and Hector Baines apparently did not have a specific complaint he was willing to make in person. Ruby almost smiled at this. That sounds like Clayton. It does, Nora agreed, and it handled Hector Baines. But Hector Baines isn't the problem. She turned the dough. Margaret Coulson is the problem. She runs the women's auxiliary. She's got a nose for anything she considers improper, and she's been telling anyone who'll listen that Mr. Keller has a woman of questionable character living under his roof. Ruby was quiet for a moment. She thought about what it would mean to have Margaret Coulson's opinion follow her around Fort McDowell for the next year. She thought about whether it mattered. She thought about the prices and whether a woman with a compromised reputation could effectively advocate for homesteaders in a territorial land dispute without becoming a liability to the people she was trying to help. It matters, she said, mostly to herself. It does, Nora said. Not for the reason Margaret Coulson thinks it matters, but it matters. Ruby looked at the correspondence on the desk. She thought about what she was doing here, and what it was becoming, and what she wanted it to be, and whether those were three different things, or the same thing seen from different angles. She hadn't let herself think about that last part directly very often. It seemed like a question that required steadier ground than she'd been standing on. Does Clayton know what Coulson's been saying? He knows, Nora said. He's been ignoring it. Because ignoring it suits him, or because he doesn't know what else to do with it. Nora looked at her. That's a good question, she said, and went back to the dough. Clayton brought it up himself, which was not what Ruby had expected. She'd expected him to continue ignoring it, or to address it in some indirect practical way, which was his tendency, not avoidance exactly, but a preference for solving problems through action rather than conversation. Came to the correspondence desk that evening, after supper, when everyone else had gone to the bunkhouse or to bed, and he sat down in the chair across from her with the look of a man who has been thinking about how to start a conversation and has not fully resolved the problem. "Nora talked to you," he said. "Yes, I should have brought it up first." He looked at the desk. "I didn't because I don't much care what Margaret Coulson thinks, and I made the mistake of letting that apply to the whole situation, which isn't fair to you." Ruby looked at him. "What does the situation look like to you?" He met her eyes. He held them steadily, which was a thing he did when Clayton Keller looked at you. He actually looked at you, without performance or evasion, and Ruby had learned that this was not as common as it should be, and was something she had come to rely on in a way she was still identifying the edges of. "It looks like something I should have addressed properly 3 months ago," he said, "but I didn't know how exactly." "You could have offered me a formal position," she said. "Manager, bookkeeper, something with a title." "I could have," he agreed, "and maybe that's the right answer." But he stopped. But what? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to redirect, which he sometimes did when a conversation got to a particular place. Then he said, "I didn't want to formalize it in the direction of employee, when what I was actually thinking was a different direction." Ruby held very still. I've been thinking about this for a while," he said. He looked at the desk. He was not, she realized, particularly comfortable with this specific kind of conversation, which she found unexpectedly reassuring. Clayton Keller was capable and direct and steady in most things, and watching him be slightly awkward, and this one made him feel more real. "I don't want to say something that puts pressure on you. You came here because you needed somewhere to be, and I don't want to make this." "Clayton," she said. He stopped. "What were you thinking?" she said. He looked at her directly. "I was thinking about whether you might want to stay. Not as an arrangement, not as an employment situation." He paused. "As something that's actually what it looks like to people in town, which is to say as a real thing." The silence in the room had a particular quality to it. Ruby was aware of the lamp on the desk, and the sound of the wind outside, and the faint creak of the house settling, and the fact that her heart was doing something in her chest that was not entirely comfortable, but was not fear either. It was something else, something she'd kept at a distance for a while. "You're asking me to marry you," she said. "You just didn't use those words." "I'm asking if the idea is something you'd consider," he said. "I understand if it's not. I understand if it's too soon. I understand if what you need right now is not to be someone's wife again, or for the first time, in the real sense of the word." He looked at the window. "I just wanted to say it plainly. So you knew what I was thinking." Ruby thought about Harold Mercer calling her marked up goods in a doorway. She thought about the man in Boston, whose name she still didn't say out loud. She thought about what marriage had looked like from the inside of a situation she had survived, and what it looked like now across a supper table, on a porch in the dark, in the particular steadiness of a man who crouched down so he wasn't looming. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course," he said. "That's not a no." "I know," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family. "Take the time you need." He stood and said goodnight and went to bed, and Ruby sat at the correspondent's desk for a long time looking at nothing and thinking about everything. She was still thinking about it 3 days later when Aldous Crane came to the ranch. She was in the barn with Rook when the horses got uneasy, not panicked. Just that subtle shift in attention that animals do when something is approaching the property that they're not sure about. Rook noticed it first and went to the barn door and looked out. "Don't know the man," Rook said. "He's got 2 riders with him." Ruby came to stand beside him, 3 horses in the yard. The man in front was perhaps 55, broad across the shoulders, with the particular posture of someone who has spent a long time being deferred to and has let it calcify into an assumption. He was well dressed for the frontier coat that fit him properly, good boots, hat, without much wear. He sat his horse with the comfort of someone who owned a lot of the land he looked at. Clayton came from the direction of the house. He walked toward the horses with no particular hurry and stopped about 10 feet from them and said something Ruby couldn't hear from the barn. The broad-shouldered man spoke back. The exchange that followed was brief and not warm, but it stayed level, no raised voices, no visible aggression. Then the man looked toward the barn. He looked at it the way someone looks at something they've already decided they don't like. Not at Rook, at Ruby. She felt it across the distance, that particular quality of being assessed and categorized by someone who has already concluded you're irrelevant and is now confirming it. Felt it from Harold Mercer. She'd felt it from men in Boston. It was a specific kind of look, and she had learned to read it accurately. Clayton said something else, and the man's gaze moved back to him. There was a beat of something that was very close to challenge, not quite, but proximate, and then the man pulled his horse around, and the three riders left the property. Clayton came to the barn. He looked at Ruby and Rook with the measured expression of someone who has just managed something and is deciding how much of it to share. That was Crane, he said. Ruby had figured that. What did he want? Came to tell me that the contest filing in the price matter was an overreach, Clayton said. He said, and I'm keeping his language, that a man who uses a woman to write legal correspondence is not someone whose judgment in land affairs should be taken seriously. Rook made a sound that was clearly something he was editing. He knows I drafted it, Ruby said. Apparently Whitmore told him, or someone at the land office did. Clayton looked at her. He also said that my ranch had developed a reputation for collecting strays, and that men in the county were starting to wonder about my judgment. The word strays landed in the air between them and sat there. What did you say? Ruby asked. I told him his concerns about my judgment were noted and that the price filing would proceed, Clayton said. And then I asked him to leave my property. He paused. He left because he wanted to, not because I made him. That's something to keep in mind. He's going to come at this differently next time. Came here to intimidate, Ruby said. He came here to measure, Clayton corrected. He wanted to see how I'd respond. He wanted to see you. He looked at her. He knows you're the one who understood the filing process. He's trying to figure out what you are here. What I am here, Ruby repeated. What you represent, he said. A ranch that does this kind of advocacy, that helps homesteaders navigate the legal system, is a different kind of problem for him than a rancher who just owns land. He's recalculating. Ruby thought about this. She thought about the letters Cecile kept in her trunk, and Elias Price's 20 years on contested land, and the clerk named Whitmore who controlled filing schedules, and Crane looking toward the barn with the flat certainty of someone who had already decided the answer. Going to try to find something to use against the filing, she said. Not against you. Against the source of it. She paused. Against me. Clayton looked at her for a long moment. Probably, he said. Which is why he stopped. Which is why my position here matters, she said. Filing to the prices. To more than that, he said quietly. She looked at him. He looked back. The barns was warm and smelled of hay and horse and the particular dusty warmth of a working building. And Rook had found something very interesting to do with a halter at the far end and was doing it with great concentration. I've been thinking, Ruby said. Clayton waited. About what you said 3 days ago. She looked at the barn door, at the yard outside, at the ranch that had taken the shape of her without her fully noticing. I've been thinking that I've spent a lot of time being afraid of things that were real dangers, and that the fear got into my body in a way that made it hard to tell the difference between a real danger and something that just resembled one. She looked at him. I don't want to make a decision from that place. That's what I was working out. He nodded slowly. I'm still working it out, she said. But I wanted you to know that the thinking is honest. That's all I need to know, he said. What happened next came from a direction none of them had anticipated, which was the thing about Crane. He was patient. And patient men don't come at you directly after being asked to leave. They find the angles you aren't watching. The angle he found was a man named Gordon Hess. Hess arrived in Fort McDowell on a Thursday in mid-July, stayed at the saloon and began talking. He was from Boston. He said he knew a woman who had come west under uncertain circumstances, had left suddenly, had reasons for the leaving that weren't entirely clean, had been involved in a situation that had come to the attention of the municipal court in ways that reflected poorly on her character. He didn't name Ruby specifically, not at first. He named Boston, and he named the year, and he described a woman who matched her general description, and he let the town connect the rest. Ruby found out about it the way information like that tends to travel in a small town, through fragments. Nora heard something at the general store and came home with the shopping, and a particular kind of quietness that meant she was deciding what to say and how. Dex came back from town 2 days later and told Clayton directly, which was how Dex handled things he thought needed to be handled, and Clayton came and found Ruby. He told her what he knew. He told her plainly and without commentary, which was the right approach, and then he waited. Ruby sat with it for a moment. She was at the correspondence desk, which was where she always was when things arrived that required her to sit still and process them. She felt the old response, trying to start the calculation of exits, the inventory of resources, the measuring of how bad this was and how fast she'd need to move. Felt it, and she recognized it, and she made herself breathe through it. Is Hess still in town? She said, as of this morning, yes. Do you know who sent him? Clayton's expression gave her the answer. Crane, she said. He was seen talking to a man on Crane's payroll 2 days before Hess arrived. Can't prove a line between them, but the geometry's not ambiguous. Ruby looked at the desk. She thought about what Hess was saying, and whether it was true, and how much of the truth could be weaponized against her, and the answer was, some of it was true, and all of it could be made to look like whatever story someone wanted to tell about it. The municipal court. She had been to the municipal court. She had tried, for almost a year, to file a protective order against a man who knew people who knew the clerk who controlled the filing schedule, and the process had failed 9 times before she gave up and left Boston instead. And the record of those filings existed somewhere, and a man with money could find it, and a man with money and patience, and a reason to destroy her credibility absolutely could travel to a town in Arizona territory and start talking in a saloon. He's going to say, I was involved in some kind of legal trouble, she said. He's implying it, Clayton said. He hasn't said anything specific enough to call a lie. Deliberate. I know. She looked at the window. Filings were mine. The protective order filings. They're in the Boston court records under my name as petitioner, but without context they look like. She stopped. They can be made to look like I was the subject of complaints, not the person making them. Clayton was very still. Is that what Hess is saying? That there were complaints against you? I don't know exactly what he's saying, but that would be the version that's most useful to Crane. She looked at Clayton. Because if the woman who drafted the price filing has a record of legal trouble in Boston, the Territorial Land Office has grounds to question the validity of any advocacy she's involved in. The silence in the room had a different quality from the other kind of silence they'd shared. This one had weight. The truth is the opposite, Clayton said. It was not a question. The truth is that I spent a year trying to get the law to protect me from a man who made it impossible. And when that failed, I left. She kept her voice level. Truth is legally complicated and takes more than a saloon conversation to establish. Then we establish it, he said. She looked at him. It's not simple. I know it's not simple. He was looking at her with an attention that was completely steady. Ruby, look at me. She was looking at him. I'm not asking about the legal situation, he said. I know who you are. I've known it since the first week. What I'm asking is whether you'll let me help you with this, or whether you're going to try to handle it alone. The thing about Clayton Keller, Ruby had learned over months, was that he did not offer to help as a form of taking over. He offered to help because he had assessed the situation and concluded his help was relevant and had the straightforwardness to say so. That was a distinct thing. She had not experienced it often enough to have it fully normalized yet. I need to write to Boston, she said. There's a lawyer there who handled the later filings. If he'll send a certified record of the case with proper context, I'll pay for whatever it costs, Clayton said. You don't need... I know I don't need to, he said. I want to. Write the letter. She wrote the letter to the Boston lawyer that evening. His name was Forsyth, and he had been a kind man in a limited situation, the kind of person who did what the system allowed and was genuinely sorry the system didn't allow more. She wrote him 3 pages explaining the situation in Arizona and what she needed and why, and she wrote it clearly and without self-pity, which was the only way she knew how to write. Clayton took it to the stage himself in the morning. While they waited, Ruby went to town. She had not done this with any intention of confronting Gordon Hess. She'd gone for supplies, legitimately, and she'd asked Dex to come with her, which he did with the easy compliance of someone who had been waiting to be asked. They went to the general store, and she gave the list to the clerk, a young man named Abe who was 17 and entirely sincere. And while Abe compiled the order, she was aware of the sound of the saloon 2 doors down and the awareness that Hess might be in it. She didn't go to the saloon. But she went to 3 other places on that main street, the dry goods, the post office, the land office, and she did her business in each one, with the quiet competence she had been building for months, and she spoke to people she knew by now, people who knew her by name, people who had seen her advocating in the price matter, and who had their own read on the woman from the Keller ranch. She was not staging a performance. She was just being present, visible. The thing Crane's approach required was her absence required her to be a rumor, a description, an implication without a face attached to it. She was providing the face. Mrs. Talley at the dry goods asked her how Elias Price's matter was progressing. It's in process, Ruby said. We expect a ruling from the territorial office by early fall. Mrs. Talley nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has strong opinions about large land operators and does not hide them. Good, she said. That man Crane has been buying up everything that isn't nailed down. About time someone put paper on it. This conversation happened in the main room of Tally's Dry Goods with two other women present, and Ruby knew the content of it would travel further than the room, and she was fine with that. At the post office, she saw through the window a man sitting in front of the saloon who was watching the street with the particular quality of someone who had been told what to look for. She thought he was probably Hess. She went about her business at the post office and came out onto the street and walked toward next had the wagon and climbed up, and if Hess was watching her, he saw a woman who was not afraid of being watched. That mattered. She had learned, years ago, that fear was information you broadcast without meaning to, and that the people who used fear as a tool were always reading that broadcast. She had spent a long time being readable. She was less readable now. Dex drove them back to the ranch and didn't say much, which was his way. But at the gate, he said, "You did all right today." "Thank you, Dex." Hess was watching from the saloon. "I know." He nodded and drove through the gate, and that was all that needed to be said about it. Nora noticed the shift in Ruby before Ruby had fully named it. It was a Sunday evening, a week after the trip to town, the kind of quiet Sunday the ranch had in the summer, when the week's work was done, and the next week's hadn't started yet. Clayton was somewhere with the horses. The ranch, his hands were at the bunkhouse. Cecile was in her room, writing something she hadn't shared yet. Nora and Ruby were on the porch, and the light was doing the thing it always did in the early evening in July, turning everything gold and long-shadowed, the kind of light that made ordinary things look like they'd been composed deliberately. "You've stopped planning your exit," Nora said. Ruby looked at her. "What? When you first came here, you were always. There was always something about you that was half out the door. Even when you were doing the correspondence. Even when you were at the supper table." Nora rocked slightly in her chair. "You had one hand on the situation and one hand on the door handle. In case you needed to leave." Ruby considered this. "That obvious." "Only if you'd seen it before," Nora said. "And I've seen it before." Ruby looked at the mountains. They were purple and enormous in the evening light, and they had the quality they always had of making her feel appropriately small without feeling diminished. "When did it change?" she said. "I'm asking you," Nora said. She thought about it. She thought about the Greer letter and Crane's visit to the barn, and Hess in front of the saloon, and the conversation at the correspondence desk, where Clayton had said, "Look at me," and she had looked and found nothing in him that required her to have one hand on the door handle. "I don't know exactly," she said, "but I think the door handle isn't where I put my hand anymore." Nora made the sound in her throat that was her version of acknowledgement. "Clayton's a good man," she said. "He's not a perfect man. He works too hard, and he doesn't talk enough about the things that bother him. And he waited way too long to say what he actually wanted, because he was afraid of pressuring you." She paused. "But good. I know." Ruby said, "Do you know what you're going to say to him?" Ruby thought about it. She thought about 3 months on a ranch that had taken the shape of her without her fully noticing. She thought about what it meant to build something rather than survive something, the difference in how those two things felt from the inside. She thought about the dried flower on the windowsill that she still hadn't thrown away, and Agnes moving differently under her when she'd finally stopped managing and started writing, and Elias Price reading the letter slowly because he wanted to understand every word. "I think I know," she said. Nora rocked. The light went from gold to amber. Somewhere down the mountain, something called out in the way animals did at evening, brief and clear and gone. "He's at the paddock," Nora said. "He goes there on Sunday evenings. Has since he was a boy." Ruby got up from the chair. She looked at Nora, who was looking at the mountains with the particular peacefulness of a woman who has set something in motion and is content to let it move. The walk to the paddock was not long, but it felt like it had weather in it, the particular atmospheric pressure of something about to change. Clayton was at the fence with his forearms resting on the top rail, watching the horses move in the fading light, and he heard her coming and didn't turn until she was beside him. They stood at the fence together. The horses moved in the way horses do in the evening, unhurried, following their own logic. "I've been thinking," Ruby said. He looked at her. "About what you asked." She kept her eyes on the horses. "About what I said. About the fear and not wanting to decide from that place." She felt her heartbeat in a very specific way. "I think I've been waiting to feel completely certain, and I think that's not how it works. I think you feel about as certain as you're ever going to feel, and then you decide." Clayton was completely still. "I feel as certain as I'm going to feel," she said. She looked at him. So yes, he looked at her for a long moment. His expression was the one she trusted most, not performed, not managed, just there. "Real yes," he repeated. "Yes," she said. He turned back to the fence. She thought for a moment He was going to say something measured and considered, the way he usually did, and then he laughed a short, quiet sound that was surprised and genuine, and entirely unlike his regular measured self, and it was the best thing she had heard in a long time. "All right," he said. "All right." They stood at the fence in the last of the evening light, and the horses moved in the paddock, and the mountains went dark behind them, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And the silence between them was the kind that doesn't require filling, the kind built from something real. Ruby felt the door handle let go. She'd released it maybe. Or maybe she'd just finally stopped needing it. Either way, her hand was free. The letter from Forsyth arrived 11 days after Ruby had sent hers. Clayton brought it in from the stage on a Wednesday afternoon and set it on the correspondence desk without comment, the way he always handled mail that wasn't his present. Step back, let the person decide what to do with it. Ruby recognized the handwriting on the envelope and felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the close cousin of it that lives just adjacent, the bracing that happens before you open something that could go either way. She opened it. Forsyth had written 4 pages in the careful, thorough hand of a man who took his profession seriously and who had, apparently, been waiting for someone to give him an opportunity to set the record straight. He'd anticipated what she needed without her having to spell out every detail, which told her he had kept a better memory of her case than she'd expected. He wrote that he was prepared to provide a certified copy of the full case record, all 9 filings, the court's responses to each, the documented evidence of procedural obstruction, and his own written summary of the circumstances that had led her to abandon the process. He wrote that he could have the certified package to her within 3 weeks if she confirmed she needed it. He wrote, at the end, in language that was more personal than the rest of the letter. He was glad she had found somewhere safe, and he was sorry the system had not done better by her when she had needed it to. Ruby sat with the letter in her hands for a while. Then she put it down and wrote the confirmation back and gave it to Clayton, and he took it to the stage that same afternoon. That evening, at supper, she told the table all of it, in plain terms, without hedging, not because she owed them the story, but because she had decided she was done managing information about herself from a position of shame for things she hadn't done. Nora listened without expression. Dex listened without expression. Foster stared at the table in a way that was not indifference, but was the face he made when something affected him. Rook was the only one who reacted visibly. His jaw tightened, and he looked at his plate and said, very quietly, a single word that wasn't polite, which Nora did not correct. Cecile, sitting at the far end of the table, where she had taken up permanent residence over the past 6 weeks, listened with the recognition of someone hearing their own story told in different words. She didn't say anything at the table. After supper, she helped clear the plates, and then came to Ruby in the kitchen and said, "The letter's in my trunk. I think I'm ready to do something with them." "I think you are too," Ruby said. They stayed in the kitchen after everyone else had gone and began. The wedding was Clayton's idea in terms of timing, and Ruby's in terms of form, and Nora's in terms of almost everything else, whether anyone acknowledged that or not. Clayton had said, the morning after the paddock, that they could do it whenever she wanted, and that he had no particular requirements about ceremony. Ruby had said she didn't want anything large, which was less about the cost, and more about the fact that large ceremonies required a community that had fully made up its mind about you, and Fort McDowell was still in the process of making up its mind. She wanted something that was real without being a performance. What they ended up with was a Saturday in late July with the justice of the peace from the county seat, a man named Aldridge, who drove out to the ranch and was offered breakfast and accepted it enthusiastically, and the people who lived and worked on the Keller ranch, arranged in the yard in the morning light. Nora wore her best dress, which was dark blue, and which she had apparently been saving for an occasion important enough to merit it. Dex and Foster were in clean shirts. Rook had made some attempt at his hair that was well-intentioned, if not entirely successful. Cecile stood near Nora and was the only one who cried briefly, which she seemed mildly annoyed at herself for. Elias and Marta Price had come in from their homestead when Clayton sent word. Elias had shaken Clayton's hand once with both of his and said nothing, because some things don't improve with language. The ceremony was short. Aldridge read the words, which were the legal words, plain and functional. Ruby and Clayton said what was required of them. Clayton's hand was warm and dry and very steady, and when he looked at her, it was with the same look he had always had, direct, present, not performing anything. She said yes when the word was called for, and he said yes, and Aldridge signed the paper, and Nora produced a cake that she had apparently been making in secret for 3 days, which was either a gesture of confidence in the outcome or a commitment to eating cake regardless. Cake had a piece of dried fruit in it that Rook nearly broke a tooth on, and Dex told a story about a horse that made no apparent point, but that everyone laughed at. And Marta Price sat with Cecile for almost an hour in the shade of the porch, and they talked quietly, and Ruby didn't hear what they said, but she noticed that Cecile's posture was different. Afterwards, something loosened in the set of her shoulders. It was not a perfect day. It was hot, and Aldridge stayed too long because of the cake and the hospitality, and at some point in the early afternoon, one of the horses got into the vegetable garden, and Rook had to go retrieve it. And there was a period of about 20 minutes when the celebration had the slightly deflated quality of an event that has passed its peak and isn't sure what to do next. Ruby burned her hand slightly on the coffee pot and spent several minutes being more irritated about this than the situation warranted. But when the afternoon shadows started to stretch long across the yard and the Prices made their departure and Aldridge finally drove back toward the county seat, Ruby sat on the porch in the chair that had been hers since before it was formally hers. And she looked at the ranch, the barn, and the bunkhouse, and the garden, with its repaired fence, and the mountains beyond all of it. She felt something that she didn't have a single clean word for. It was complicated in the way that real things are complicated. It had weight and warmth, and something that was cautious in one corner and open in all the others. Clayton came and sat in the other chair. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He reached over and touched her burned hand, briefly, the place where she'd gotten it on the coffee pot, and then he put his hand back on the arm of his chair, and they sat in the evening, the way they'd been sitting on this porch for months quietly, without needing it to be anything else. August came in harder than July, which was saying something. The heat in Arizona in August was not the Boston kind of summer heat, which was humid and pressing and got into buildings and stayed. The Arizona heat was direct and enormous, the kind that made you understand why everything out here, the plants, the animals, the people had adapted toward patience and shadow and the willingness to wait out the worst hours of the day. Ruby had spent her first Arizona some fighting the heat, and she had spent the second half of it learning to work around it. Up before dawn to get the correspondence and the heavy work done, inside or in shade during the brutal midday hours, back to work in the late afternoon when the sun started its descent. She was better at a lot of things by August. She could read the horse's states now with enough accuracy that she'd twice noticed a problem before it became a problem. Once a loose shoe on Clayton's main working horse that would have gone lame within a day. Once an early sign of colic in one of the barn horses that Rook confirmed when she mentioned it. She still rode Agnes, but she'd started occasionally working with a younger horse named Cato who was more responsive and less forgiving of distraction, which Rook said was a reasonable progression, and which Dex watched without comment from the fence the first few times. She was better at the land work too, not the physical ranch labor, which was not her domain, and she didn't pretend otherwise, but the administrative structure of it. She'd reorganized the entire Keller Ranch record system over the summer, which had involved several long evenings, with Clayton going through what was there, what was missing, what needed to be filed or renewed or updated. He was not a natural record keeper. He thought in horses and pasture and weather, not in columns and categories. But he was honest about what he didn't know how to do, and he trusted her to do it, which was more valuable than someone who pretended to know and got in the way. The Forsyth package arrived in mid-August, a thick envelope, properly certified, the kind of package that had heft in the hand and heft in what it contained. Ruby opened it at the correspondence desk and went through it carefully. 4 pages of case summary in Forsyth's clean hand. 9 filing receipts with court stamps. A letter from the court clerk that was bureaucratically neutral on its face, and if you read it right, documented exactly the point at which a process that should have moved had not moved for reasons that were not procedural. She read it twice, then she set it down and sat with it for a while. It was strange looking at the documented history a year of her life laid out in numbered pages. It was stranger still to see it from outside, to see how clearly the obstruction was visible once you were looking for it, how obvious the pattern was, how a competent person with the right perspective could read it in 20 minutes and understand what had happened. She had been inside it, and inside it had felt like confusion and walls, and not knowing which direction was forward. That was what those situations did. They made you unsure of your own reading of them. She put the pages in a clean folder and wrote Forsyth a letter of thanks that took her 3 drafts to get right, not because she didn't know what to say, But because what she wanted to say was more personal than professional correspondence usually accommodated, and she had to find the right register between the two. That evening, she showed the folder to Clayton. He read it with the same steady thoroughness he brought to everything. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. "What do you want to do with it?" he said. "I want to make sure it's available if Crane or Hess or anyone else tries to use the Boston record against us," she said. "I want Superintendent Greer's office to have a copy on file, attached to the price matter, so that if anyone challenges the validity of my involvement, the response is already there." "That's good thinking," he said. "It's also I want to send a copy to the Frontier Matrimonial Correspondence Agency," she said. "The director." Clayton looked at her. "Harold Mercer used their service," she said. "He told them to send a woman of good health and sound appearance, and then he turned me away in a doorway and called me marked up goods. And the agency is still operating, and there will be other women who come through that agency to men like Mercer." She looked at the folder. "If they have this on file, if they know who I am and what my actual history is, then, when Mercer tries to use the agency again, they have something to weigh against him." Clayton was quiet for a moment. "You're trying to protect someone you haven't met yet. Somebody should have done it for me," she said. She said it without bitterness, just as fact. He nodded once. "Write the letter." Gordon Hess left Fort McDowell on a Thursday in the second week of August. Ruby found this out from Abe at the general store, who mentioned it with the offhandedness of someone reporting a minor shift in the weather. The man who'd been at the saloon for 3 weeks had settled up and taken the stage east. Didn't say where he was going, she told Clayton that evening. He absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, without visible reaction. Then a period of quiet, then a considered response. "Crane pulled him," he said. "Why?" "Because Hess wasn't accomplishing what he came to accomplish," Clayton said. "You went to town. You did your business in front of people. The certified record is in the land office. The story he came to tell didn't find the ground it needed." He looked at the yard. "Crane's not done, but he's done with this particular approach. What's the next approach? That's what I'm trying to figure out." He picked up his hat from the porch railing. "He's got money, and he's got patience, and he's got a water source problem. Those things don't go away. They just change direction." Ruby thought about this. She'd been thinking about it, actually, for several weeks, about the shape of Crane's problem and what avenues were left to him once the informal pressure failed. The territorial land office dispute was moving through proper channels. The social pressure campaign had not accomplished what he'd hoped. The direct intimidation visit to the ranch had not changed Clayton's behavior. What was left was the legal process itself, and whether inside that process there was a move he could make. "He's going to challenge the standing of the filing," she said. "Not the content. The standing." Clayton looked at her. "The filing is in your name," she said. "You're advocating on behalf of the prices. The grounds for challenge would be that you have a financial interest in the water access dispute, that a ruling in the Price's favor would benefit the Keller Ranch in some indirect way, and therefore the advocate can't be considered disinterested." "Keller Ranch doesn't share water access with the Price land," Clayton said. "I know, but the argument doesn't have to be accurate. It has to be filed, and it has to require a response, which delays the process, which is what Crane needs more time to put more pressure on Elias." She looked at the mountains. "I'd file that challenge if I were him. It's the cleanest legal move he has left. Can we preempt it?" She thought about that. "Possibly. If we file a secondary advocate statement, someone with no property interest whatsoever who can demonstrate legal understanding of the claim. Someone who can stand as a co-petitioner and whose standing can't be challenged the same way." She paused. "There's a lawyer in Tucson, a woman named Harriet Voss. She does territorial land work. I found her name in the regulations archive when I was going through the Price documents. She's filed 3 similar cases in the past 2 years. You want to bring in a lawyer. I want to have one available if Crane challenges the standing," she said. "And I want to write to her now, before he makes the move, so we're not reacting. We're ready." Clayton looked at her for a long moment. She had, she knew, taken the Price matter considerably further than its original scope. What had started as a correspondence filing had become something closer to an ongoing legal strategy. She wasn't sure in this moment whether she'd overstepped. "When did you figure all this out?" he said. "Last week," she said. "I've been waiting to see if Crane would do something first. You figured out his next move before he made it." "I've had practice reading that kind of thinking," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, then to Harriet Voss. Cecile's situation resolved, and it resolved unexpectedly cleanly, which Ruby had learned to be suspicious of things that resolved cleanly usually had a rough edge somewhere that you found later. The letters from Cecile's husband, combined with a certified statement that Cecile had written with Ruby's help over several evenings at the kitchen table, went to a family law practitioner in Albuquerque through a contact that Harriet Voss's office provided. The practitioner, a man named Serrano, who had a reputation for taking cases that were difficult because he seemed to find the difficulty interesting, reviewed the letters and wrote back within 2 weeks with an assessment of what could be filed and what the likely outcomes were. It was not a resolution by any stretch. It was the beginning of a process that would take time and cost money and require Cecile to do difficult things. But it was a process. It was documented. It existed in formal records in a jurisdiction where her husband could not control the filing schedule. Cecile read Serrano's letter at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, with Ruby across from her and Nora at the stove, pretending not to listen with the transparent inattention of someone absolutely listening. When she finished, she set the letter down and looked at the table. Her hands were flat on the surface. "He's going to be furious," she said. "Yes," Ruby said. "He's going to try to find me. He might. But finding you is different from doing anything about what you've filed." Ruby looked at her. "You're on record." "He's on record. That changes the math." Cecile looked at her hands. "I've been afraid of him for so long that I've forgotten what it feels like to be doing something rather than hiding from something." "It feels like this," Ruby said. Uncomfortable and correct at the same time. Cecile looked up. Something in her face was different, not fixed, not resolved, but realigned. Like a thing that had been slightly crooked for a long time had been straightened enough to function. "Will you help me with the response to Serrano?" "Yes," Ruby said. Nora set 2 cups of tea on the table without comment and went back to the stove. The ruling from Superintendent Greer's office came on a Friday in early September, and it came in a form no one had entirely anticipated. Ruby was at the correspondence desk when Clayton came in from town. She saw his face before he said anything. It was the controlled expression, the one he used when something had happened that required processing before commenting. He set the envelope on the desk and she opened it. The ruling was 5 pages. It confirmed the Price Water Access claim as valid under the original 1877 filing. It dismissed the disputed status that had been entered 18 months earlier, citing procedural irregularities in how the dispute had been initiated. It noted, in language that was technically measured but was, between the lines, pointed, that the dispute entry had not followed the proper notification requirements and was therefore void from its initiation. Procedural irregularities. Whitmore, probably. Whitmore, who had controlled the filing schedules and had done business of some kind with Crane. Greer's office had apparently decided that whatever Crane offered was not worth the exposure of a ruling that could be appealed and examined. They found something on Whitmore, Ruby said. Or on Crane's connection to Whitmore, Clayton said. Either way, they made the problem go away by ruling correctly. He sat down, which is actually the best outcome. A correct ruling is harder to appeal than a political one. Crane can still appeal this. He can. But he'd be appealing a ruling that found procedural irregularities in the original dispute filing, which means his appeal draws scrutiny to how that dispute was filed in the first place. He looked at her. He won't appeal. Ruby read the ruling again. She was looking for the part that said what it actually meant for Elias Price for 20 years of work on a homestead, for fence lines and water rights, and the particular dignity of a man who had built something with his hands and had been slowly, systematically threatened with losing it. It meant he kept it. That was what it meant. Plain as that. Put the ruling down. She felt something in her chest that was not small. She held it for a moment before she said anything. "We should tell them today," she said. "I've got horses saddled," Clayton said. They rode to the Price homestead in the late morning, and Ruby saw Marta Price come out of the house before they'd reached the gate. Marta had been watching for riders, apparently, or had the instinct for arrivals that long years in a remote place developed. She shaded her eyes, and then she went back inside, and Ruby heard her call Elias's name. Came out of the barn. He walked toward them with the careful walk of someone whose joints complained in the morning and who had stopped expecting good news. Clayton handed him the ruling from the saddle, and he read it standing in the yard, slowly the way he always read things, making sure he understood each word before moving to the next. When he finished, he looked up. His face did not transform into something cinematic. He was not a man who expressed things dramatically. What happened was smaller than that, and more real. His jaw moved slightly, like he was recalibrating something, and he looked at the land around his homestead. pasture and the fence lines and the outbuildings he'd built himself across 2 decades. And then he looked at Ruby. "You did most of this," he said. "We did it together," she said. He looked at Clayton. "Your wife?" he said. And there was something in how he said it, not commentary, just acknowledgement that recognized what the word meant in context of what she'd done. Then he looked back at Ruby. "Thank you." Marta came to stand beside him and took his arm and looked at the ruling and then looked at the mountains. And you could see on her face the particular relief of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told they can put it down. They stayed for coffee. Elias talked about the fall grazing plans, practical, forward-looking, the talk of a man who has remembered that he has a future on his own land. Marta asked Ruby questions about the ranch, about the summer, about Cecile, whom Marta had apparently thought about since the wedding. It was ordinary conversation. It was the kind of conversation that's only possible when the emergency is over, and the long, ordinary stretch ahead can be anticipated again. Riding home in the afternoon, Ruby and Clayton went slowly because there was no particular hurry. September sun was cooler than August, still warm but not pressing, and the country looked different in it, more textured, more detailed, like the summer heat had been flattening everything, and the dropping temperature was letting it come back into focus. "You're quiet," Clayton said. "Thinking," she said. "About what?" She thought about how to answer that accurately. She was thinking about the shape of the year from a sidewalk in Fort McDowell with $42, to a correspondence desk, to a paddock fence at dusk, to a ruling from the Territorial Land Office that gave an old man his land back. She was thinking about how none of it had been a plan. She had made one decision at a time with what she had, in the direction of something better than what she was leaving. That was all it had been. About how things accumulate, she said finally. Small decisions. You don't see the shape of them until you're far enough along to look back. Clayton rode beside her in silence for a moment. What does the shape look like from here? She looked at the road ahead, which curved toward the ranch gate in the distance, toward the mountain range beyond it, and the late afternoon sky above that, which was doing the Arizona thing it always did, turning colors that Boston had never offered her, filling the whole enormous sky with something she didn't have the right words for and had stopped trying to find them. Like something that held, she said. September moved through its two halves, with the particular quality of early autumn in Arizona, the mornings cool enough to make you think fall was arriving, the afternoons reminding you that it was only September, and the country still had things to say about heat. The ranch settled into its fall rhythms, the last of the summer pasture being evaluated for winter capacity, supply orders for the cold months being drafted, the maintenance work that had been deferred in the busy summer finding its way back to the list. Harriet Voss wrote from Tucson in response to Ruby's letter, and the response was thorough and professionally warm, the tone of someone who recognized in the inquiry a mind that understood what it was asking. She noted that the price matter had resolved well, and that the approach of preemptive certified filing was, in her opinion, underused by non-lawyers who were capable of it. She wrote that if Ruby was ever in Tucson, she would be glad to have a conversation about land advocacy work and the practical education available to people who wanted to do it properly. Ruby read this letter twice. She put it in the drawer where she kept things she was thinking about. Cecile had been in contact with Serrano twice more, and the process was moving in the slow, grinding way of legal processes involving resistant husbands. But it was moving. She had taken over the vegetable garden entirely by this point. Nora had effectively retired from it, and now merely supervised and ate the results, which satisfied everyone. Cecile had also begun helping with the general store's bookkeeping, 2 mornings a week, which Abe's father had proposed because he'd heard about the ranch records from someone and had asked Clayton about it, and Clayton had asked Cecile, and Cecile had said yes, with the particular quality of someone who needed something of her own to stand on. She was building that. She didn't talk much about it. She didn't need to. Ruby was at the correspondence desk on a Thursday afternoon in late September when she became suddenly and acutely aware that she did not feel well. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself with urgency. She just felt off, in the specific way that she had learned to notice over years of paying close attention to her own body as a form of survival. She sat with it for a while, cataloging it. Then she sat with the catalog for a while longer. Then she did some accounting of a different kind. She put the pen down. She looked at the desk. She looked at the window, at the September light on the yard. She thought about the calendar in the way you think about a calendar when you are checking something specific, going back through the weeks with the particular focus of someone looking for a pattern in data They already half understand. She was not entirely surprised by what she found. She was still surprised enough that she had to sit with it for several minutes. She did not say anything that day. She sat with the information and turned it over and looked at it from different sides and made sure she wasn't misreading it. She thought about what it meant and what it would change and what it would not change. And by the time the lamp needed lighting, she had arrived at something that was not a conclusion exactly, but was a settled enough place that she could stand on it. She waited 2 more weeks to be sure. She told Clayton on a Saturday evening, on the porch, in the dark, when the stars were doing what they always did out here, filling the whole sky with more than seemed possible, more than she had known a sky could hold when she'd lived somewhere, with walls built close on every side. She told him plainly. She had learned, in the time they'd been together, that he received plain information better than it being worked up to, that the approach mattered less to him than the truth of the thing. He was quiet for a moment, not the calculating quiet, the other kind. Then he turned and looked at her with the same steady look he had always had, the one that didn't require anything from her, and she saw something in it that she'd seen in pieces before, but not assembled quite like this, not with this particular quality of depth. "Are you all right?" he said. It was the first thing he asked. Not wonder, not announcement, not his own feelings about it. The first question was about her. She looked at the stars. "I'm all right," she said. "I'm a lot of things right now, but I'm all right." He nodded. He put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair, the same way he had on the day of the wedding, briefly and then settled, and left it there. They sat like that for a long time, in the cool September dark, with the mountains invisible but present in the way they always were, in the particular weight of things you can't see but know are there. Nora was going to be insufferable about this, Ruby thought. She was going to be so thoroughly, quietly right about everything, in the way she was right about most things, and she was going to say almost nothing about any of it, and that would be the most insufferable part. Ruby was already in some complicated corner of herself, looking forward to it. The horses moved in the barn. The wind came down from the mountains the way it always did at night, carrying the smells of stone and distance, and things older than any of the problems they had solved this year. Clayton's hand was warm and still over hers. The year had started on a sidewalk. A woman with a traveling bag and a healing bruise and $42 and a decision to make. It was not the same year anymore. It was not the same woman. That was the thing about accumulation. You didn't see the shape of it until you were far enough along to look back. And what Ruby saw, looking back from the porch of a ranch, that was hers in the real sense now, in the way that had nothing to do with paperwork, and everything to do with belonging, what she saw was that the shape had been building longer than she knew. Every decision made toward something better rather than just away from something worse. Every piece of paper properly filed. Every person let in through a gate that stayed open. She had not been building toward this moment. She had just been building. And this was where it had led. The night settled around them. Stars held their positions, indifferent and bright. Ruby held on to that, the warmth of his hand, the dark mountains, the particular quiet of a place where she no longer listened for threats in the silence, and let herself, for once, not measure what came next. Just this, for now, just this. Found out on a Tuesday morning and said nothing for approximately 4 minutes, which was the longest Ruby had ever seen Nora say nothing about anything. She had come into the kitchen early, before the ranch hands, before Clayton had finished his morning round of the barn, and Nora had been at the stove with her back turned, and Ruby had simply said it plain, the way she said most now and then, waited. Nora turned around. She looked at Ruby with an expression that moved through several things too quickly to fully name, and then settled into something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory as one. The kind of expression that lives on the face of someone who has been right about something for a long time, and is experiencing the particular satisfaction of seeing it confirmed. Then she turned back to the stove. "You'll need to stop riding Cato," she said. "Agnes is smoother," that was all she said. But that evening, without announcement or ceremony, she moved the good chair from the corner of the sitting room to the correspondence desk where Ruby worked, because it had better back support, and she never mentioned why. Ruby let her. That was how things worked here. You accepted what was offered without making it into a production, and you moved forward, and the accumulation of small, unremarked kindnesses became the structure of a life. October came in cool, and the ranch turned its attention to winter preparation in earnest. Pasture assessments Clayton had been running through September produced a plan for rotating the herd through the lower grazing sections, which meant fence work along the eastern boundary, which meant several weeks of the ranch hands out in the field, while Clayton moved between the house and the range in the particular restless way he got during seasonal transitions, not anxious, just kinetic, his mind working through logistics in the way it always did, visible in the way he held his coffee cup and looked at the middle distance at breakfast. Ruby had learned to read him well enough by now to know when to let the logistics run their course and when to interrupt them. She had also learned that he was not good at stopping, which was different from being a workaholic. In the performed sense, it wasn't ego or avoidance. It was just the deep habit of a man who had been responsible for everything on this property for a long time and had not yet fully recalibrated to the fact that someone was now responsible with him. She interrupted him one evening when he came in late from the south pasture and sat down at the supper table with the look of someone who was going to eat while continuing to think about fence posts. "Stop for an hour," she said. He looked at her. "The fence will be the same fence in an hour," she said. "Eat. Actually eat." He looked at the plate. Then he looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was him recognizing she was right and adjusting accordingly, which he did without resentment, which was one of the things about him she had come to rely on. "All right," he said, and picked up his fork and actually ate. After supper, on the porch, he said, "I don't always know I'm doing it," she said. "My father was the same way," he said. "My mother used to send him to sit by the creek for an hour when he got like that. He'd come back different. I don't have a creek." "The porch works," he said. They sat in the October dark, and Ruby thought about what it meant to know someone well enough to interrupt them productively and to be known well enough to be interrupted that way, and how this kind of knowledge accumulated so gradually you didn't notice it until the day you reached for it and found it there, solid and reliable, built from 1,000 small mornings and evenings that hadn't seemed significant at the time. The letter from the Frontier Matrimonial Correspondence Agency arrived in late October, and it was not what Ruby had expected. She had sent them Forsyth's certified record and a letter explaining Harold Mercer's conduct and what it had meant in practice, not as a complaint seeking redress, but as information she believed the agency had an obligation to hold. She had not expected a response. Agencies like that received complaints and filed them and moved on. The response came from the director himself, a man named Colm Shaughnessy, who wrote 5 pages in a hand that was cramped but legible. He had reviewed the Forsyth record. He had it emerged, received one previous complaint about Mercer from a woman who had been sent to him 2 years earlier and had returned east within a week with a story she'd been reluctant to formalize. He had not followed up on it with the thoroughness it deserved. He wrote this directly, without excessive apology, but with a plainness that Ruby recognized as genuine accountability, the tone of someone naming what they'd done wrong without dressing it up. He was removing Harold Mercer from the agency's approved roster. He was reviewing the complaint protocols. He wanted to know if Ruby was willing, whether she would be available for correspondence consultation on cases where women wrote to the agency with concerns about their placements, not a formal role. He was clear he had no structure for that, but as an informal advisor who had experienced the system from inside it. Ruby read the letter twice. Then she set it down and looked at the desk for a while. Thought about the woman who had gone to Mercer 2 years earlier and come back east within a week. She thought about what that week had been. She thought about the $42 and the sidewalk and what would have happened if Clayton Keller had not had a feeling that he should stay nearby when something was about to go wrong. She wrote back to Shaughnessy that afternoon. Yes, she was willing. She did not tell Clayton about this immediately. She sat with it for a day, which was her way with things she needed to be sure about, before making them real by saying them out loud. The next evening she told him on the porch. He listened. When she finished, he looked at the mountains for a moment. "That's going to be work," he said. "I know. The kind that doesn't have clear hours." "I know. Good work, though," he said. He said it, simply not as encouragement, but as assessment, the way he said things he actually meant. "Important work, I think so." He nodded. "Then do it." That was the whole conversation. She had not needed permission, and he had not offered it. He had just confirmed what she already knew, which was exactly what she had needed, and was a different thing from permission and more useful. Aldous Crane filed his challenge to the price ruling in November. Ruby had expected it. She had told Clayton in September that Crane would not appeal, and she had been wrong about that, which she noted without excessive self-criticism, because being wrong was information too. He had filed not a direct appeal of the ruling, but a lateral challenge, a claim that Clayton's original filing had misrepresented the relationship between the Keller Ranch and the Price water access, implying a financial benefit that made the advocacy conflicted. It was the move she had anticipated and had prepared for. Harriet Voss's name was already in the record. Ruby wrote to her the day the challenge arrived and had a response within the week Voss was ready, had reviewed the materials Ruby had sent in September, and had identified the precise regulatory language that dismantled Crane's conflict claim before it could gain traction. What followed was 6 weeks of correspondence that Ruby managed from the desk while Voss handled the formal filings. And what it required was patience and precision, and the willingness to sit with uncertainty while the process moved at the speed processes moved, which was never fast enough when something you cared about was at stake. Elias Price wrote during this period a short letter, 3 lines, in the deliberate handwriting of a man who didn't write often and chose his words accordingly. He said he trusted the outcome was in capable hands. He said the fall grazing had gone well, and the water from his creek ran clear into November. He said Marta sent her regards. Ruby kept the letter in the drawer with the Forsyth papers and the letter from Harriet Voss and Shaughnessy's 5 pages. She was keeping, she realized, a record of a different kind than the livestock ledgers, a record of what had been built this year, in paper and decision, and the slow accumulation of things done right. Challenge failed in December. Voss's filing had been precise enough that the Territorial Reviewing Board dismissed Crane's conflict claim within 3 weeks of receiving it, which was unusually fast, and which told Ruby that the board had seen this kind of challenge before and was not interested in accommodating it. Price ruling stood. The water access was formally confirmed. Case was closed. Voss wrote to Ruby with the outcome and added a paragraph that was separate in tone from the rest, more personal, more direct. She had been practicing land advocacy in the Arizona Territory for 7 years. She had seen the kind of work Ruby had done from the outside of formal legal training, the filing strategy, the preemptive approach, the understanding of how bureaucratic systems could be navigated from a non-legal position, and she had rarely seen it done as well. There were options, if Ruby was interested, for formalizing that understanding. Not a lawyer, the territorial requirements for that were long and expensive, but a certified land advocate, which was a newer designation the territory had established, precisely because the need existed, and the lawyers couldn't fill it alone. Ruby read this paragraph 3 times. She had not thought about herself in those terms. She had thought about each problem as it arrived: the Price matter, Crane's challenge, Cecile's letters, Shaughnessy's inquiry, and she had solved each one with what she had, which was reading and precision, and the particular kind of intelligence that comes from having spent years navigating systems that were not designed to help you. She had not thought of it as a practice. She had not thought of it as something with a name. She put Voss's letter in the drawer and sat for a long time looking at the window. The thing about surviving a difficult situation, and Ruby had had years now to think about this, in the quiet parts of the night and the long mornings at the desk, is that it doesn't automatically turn into anything. Survival is not a credential. The years she'd spent managing fear and calculating exits and learning how systems worked against people who needed them to work for them, none of that was visible on the outside. None of it had a form until you gave it one. She was being offered a form. That evening after supper, she showed Clayton the letter. He read it at the table while the lamp burned and the house settled around them in its evening sounds. When he finished, he set the letter down. He looked at her with the full steadiness of his attention. "Is this what you want?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I'm afraid to want it." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you afraid of specifically?" She thought about it honestly, which he'd always made easier to do. "That I'll fail at something formal when I've only succeeded at things that weren't formal," she said. "That the structure will show me where my limits are. It'll also show you where they aren't," he said. She looked at the letter. "It's either very wise or very simple." "Probably both," he said. "Most true things are." She picked the letter up. She thought about Elias Price, reading the filing response slowly, making sure he understood every word. She thought about Cecile's posture changing after the conversation with Marta. She thought about the woman who had gone to Harold Mercer 2 years before she did and had come back east within a week without formalizing anything, because there had been no structure for it, no record, nothing that made the thing real and hard to ignore. She thought about what a certified land advocate could have done for that woman. She thought about what one could do for the next one. "I'm going to write to Voss," she said. "Good," he said, and stood up and took the lamp to the kitchen to get the last of the coffee, and came back and set a cup in front of her, and that was that. The baby came in late February. It was not a smooth arrival, which was true of most arrivals in Ruby's experience. The things that matter most rarely come in smoothly. There were 18 hours that Ruby would remember afterward more in impression than in detail, the way the body manages difficult things by not encoding them too precisely. Nora was there. A doctor came from Fort McDowell, a competent man named Henshaw, who had been doing this for 20 years and had the manner of someone who was very good at not adding alarm to situations that already had enough. Clayton was outside the door for most of it, which was where he'd been told to be, and Ruby was aware of this, aware of him on the other side of the wall. Not pacing, she suspected, because pacing wasn't how he handled things, but present in the way he was always present, steady and close, not going anywhere. The baby was a girl. She arrived at 4 a.m, in the dark part of February that doesn't know yet it's almost over, and she announced herself clearly and without ambiguity, which Nora said was a good sign, and which Ruby, lying there with her in her arms in the absolute exhaustion that follows 18 hours of that kind of work, thought was probably accurate. Clayton came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the two of them with an expression that Ruby had never seen on him before and could not fully describe. It was something past his usual steadiness, something deeper than that, something that had no useful armor over it. Came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, and then looked at Ruby. "All right," he said, the same first question he always asked. "Tired," she said, "and all right." He looked at the baby. His jaw moved slightly, the same small recalibration she'd seen when he'd read the price ruling. He put out one finger, and the baby curled her hand around it with the automatic grip of new things that don't know yet how large the world is. And Clayton held very still, like he was afraid to move and break the connection. "She's strong," he said. "Give her a minute," Ruby said. "She's been working hard." He looked up at her, and the almost smile was there, the one that lived at the corner of his mouth. "Both of you have," he said. Nora came in long enough to determine that everyone was alive and in acceptable condition, and then went back to the kitchen, because Nora's version of tenderness was maintaining the structure of practical things, so the tender moments could happen without interruption. Ruby lay in the blue dark of early morning and held her daughter and listened to the ranch, the horses in the barn, the wind from the mountains, the house around her that had been building itself into the shape of her life for almost a year now. She thought about what she had arrived with, and what she had built, and what was in her arms. She had not come west looking for this. She had come west looking for a way out of something, which was a different kind of looking entirely. She had been looking backward, mostly trying to get enough distance from what was behind her to breathe. The thing about looking backward is that you can't see what's in front of you, and what was in front of her had turned out to be more than she had known how to want. That was the thing nobody told you about surviving. They told you it was enough, that making it out was the achievement, that getting safe was the goal. And it was true as far as it went. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that after the surviving came the living, and the living was its own kind of work, its own kind of courage, and it required a different set of tools than the ones you'd built for endurance. Ruby had had to learn those tools here, on this ranch, with these people. She was still learning them. Spring arrived the way it always did in Arizona, not as a dramatic shift, but as a slow accumulation of smaller shifts, the mornings getting lighter, the ground releasing some of what it had held all winter. First patches of color appearing in the desert that looked almost wrong at first, because you'd forgotten things could grow there. The seal had moved to Fort McDowell by March. Serrano's work had produced an outcome that was not everything she'd wanted, but was enough a formal separation, documented and filed. Her husband's access to her legally constrained in ways that had teeth. She had a room at the boarding house, and 2 mornings a week of bookkeeping for Abe's father, and a garden she was planning for the property behind the boarding house. The landlord had given her permission to use on the grounds that anything she grew there would improve the view. She came to the ranch on Sundays. She had become, in the way of people who share the experience of surviving something parallel, a particular kind of friend to Ruby, not the kind that required constant contact or shared history going back decades, but the kind built on recognition, on having seen each other in the unguarded moments that hard circumstances produce. She held the baby on Sunday afternoons with the careful competence of someone who had been around babies before, and said little about it, and looked quietly happy. She had heard from Serrano in April that her husband had stopped contesting the separation terms. Fight had been expensive, and he had run the numbers, and the numbers had told him to stop. Cecile reported this with the neutral tone of someone describing weather conditions, and Ruby understood that the neutral tone was not indifference, but was what came after a long time of something mattering enormously, the flatness of aftermath, the way the body quiets when the emergency finally ends. "Are you all right?" Ruby asked. "I'm going to be," Cecile said. "That's different from all right now, but it's something." Ruby knew the difference. She'd lived in it. The certification examination for Territorial Land Advocate was administered in Tucson in May, and Ruby went to Tucson on a Tuesday and took it and came back on a Thursday. Clayton had the ranch. Nora had the baby, about which she had no complaints that anyone was invited to hear. Rook had apparently spent both days working on a project in the barn that he was cagey about, and that turned out, when Ruby returned, to be a small wooden rocking chair sized for a child, which he had built from scrap timber with more skill than anyone had known he possessed, and which he presented by leaving it on the porch and walking away before she could respond, which was completely consistent. She had passed the examination. Voss had prepared her, had sent reading materials and sample filings, and had written detailed letters in response to Ruby's questions that were essentially a private course in territorial land law from someone who had been practicing it for years. Ruby had done the work over the winter months between the baby and the correspondence and the Shaughnessy advisory work. In the early mornings when the house was still quiet and the lamp was the only light and her mind was clearest, she wrote to Voss with the result. Voss wrote back immediately, which was not her usual pace, and the letter was the shortest thing Voss had ever sent her 3 lines. "Congratulations, when are you in Tucson next? I have 2 cases I'd like your eyes on." Ruby put the letter in the drawer and sat for a moment with the specific feeling of a door that had been opening for months, finally standing all the way open, letting in air from a direction she hadn't been sure existed. She had not told Nora about the examination before she went. She had not wanted the weight of expectation on it, had not wanted to manage anyone else's investment in the outcome while she was managing her own. She told her now, in the kitchen on a Friday morning, with the baby on a blanket on the floor, between them and the May light coming through the window at the good angle. Nora listened. She went on, kneading her bread dough throughout. When Ruby finished, Nora looked at her with the expression that was not quite a smile. "I knew in the first week," Nora said. "Knew what?" Ruby said. "That you were going to do something with what you knew," Nora said. "I didn't know what." But a woman who can look at a stack of damaged paperwork and see the whole shape of the problem, that's not a skill that stays on a ranch. Not entirely. Ruby looked at the baby on the blanket, who was examining her own hand with the total concentration of someone encountering something genuinely extraordinary. "Is it strange that I want to do both?" "Both what?" This she gestured at the kitchen, the house, the general everything of it. "And the other thing." Nora pressed her palms into the dough. "Women have always done both," she said. "They just didn't always get to call the second one a thing." Clayton rode out to the eastern pasture on a Saturday afternoon in June to check the fence line where the spring growth had been putting pressure on the posts, and he came back at dusk to find Ruby on the porch, with the baby asleep in the rocking chair Rook had made and a letter open on her knee, reading in the last of the light. He put the horse up and came to the porch and sat in his chair and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the look between them was the kind that doesn't require staging. "Voss has a case in the Gable Creek area," Ruby said. "Family being pressured off their land. Sound familiar?" "Sounds like it might be close to the Price place. East of there. Smaller operation. Husband died last year. Wife's been running it alone. Someone's been the approach is familiar." Clayton looked at the mountains. "Crane?" "Not Crane specifically. Someone adjacent to him." She looked at the letter. "Voss wants me on the correspondence strategy. She'll handle the formal filings." "When do you need to start?" "I already wrote back this afternoon," she said. "Told her I was on it." He looked at her, the almost smile. "Of course you did." She looked at him. "Is that all right?" He thought about this. She could see him actually considering it, not performing consideration, but doing the actual thing, which was what he always did. "The widow," he said. "What's her name?" Ruby checked the letter. "Patterson. Ida Patterson. How old is she?" Voss didn't say. "Older. Been on the land since the early 70s. 18 years on a piece of land," Clayton said, "and someone decides they can move her off it because her husband died." He looked at the mountains again, with the look he had when something bothered him, at the level where things are simply wrong, not politically wrong or strategically wrong, just wrong in the basic way. "Get her the same outcome we got Elias." "That's what I intend," Ruby said. The baby made a small sound in the rocking chair and didn't wake. The evening moved through its colors. The mountains went from purple to black against a sky that still held a strip of orange at the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the dark part above, and the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds, the horses, the wind, the creak of the wood around them. Ruby folded the letter and put it in her pocket. She thought about Ida Patterson, whom she had never met. On a piece of land she had worked for 18 years, with someone adjacent to Aldous Crane, putting the slow, patient pressure on it. She thought about what it meant to be that woman and not know that there was someone 4 miles away who understood exactly what was happening and had the tools to do something about it and was going to use them. She thought about what it would have meant for her once to know that someone like that existed. That was the thing. That was the thing at the bottom of all of it, the thing she'd been working toward without knowing she was working toward it. Through every filing and every letter and every hour at the desk, with a lamp and a stack of documents that revealed their pattern if you looked long enough. The women who got out, the ones who found the sidewalk and the stage and the $42 and the gate that was open. They didn't all find a Clayton Keller waiting on the other side. Most of them found nothing, or found something worse, and went back, or gave up, or got lost in the particular wilderness of having escaped without arriving anywhere. What they needed was not rescue. Rescue was a temporary state. What they needed was someone who understood the systems that worked against them and could work the systems back. Someone who had paper and knew where to file it, and knew the language and knew the difference between a deadline disguised as information and an actual deadline, and who would pick up a pen on their behalf at the point when picking up the pen was the right move and not the wrong one. Ruby had become that, not instead of being Clayton's wife, not instead of being her daughter's mother, not instead of running the correspondence of a working ranch, all of that. And this too, because that was how it worked when you were a woman who had learned something the hard way and decided the learning was worth something beyond your own survival. She sat on the porch in the June dark with her daughter asleep in a handmade chair and her husband beside her and a letter in her pocket that was going to require several hours of careful work tomorrow. And she felt the weight of all of it, the good weight, the kind that tells you you're carrying something real. The scar on her cheekbone was long gone, had been for over a year, but she still knew it had been there, and she thought she always would, and she had made her peace with that, because the things that mark you are part of the record too, and the record was not something to be ashamed of. It was evidence. It was documentation. It was the thing you filed properly and kept where it could be found. A woman came to Arizona with a bruise and $42 and no plan. She filed the paperwork. She learned the language. She opened the gate, and then she made sure it stayed open for whoever came next.